Hello guys, this is your friend Shinobi Nexus 2.0 and we are back in new fanfic. What if Naruto hunted the man behind the Nine Tails Part 2? Tell me, Naruto, how do you like your new squad? The Hokage asked with a smile. For whatever reason, he'd been summoned to the Hokage Tower first thing in the morning. It was odd, seeing as this was probably the first time he'd ever been alone with the leader of his village. Initially, he wasn't sure if he should be worried or excited, but he was admittedly nervous. This was the professor, the man widely considered the strongest of the five Kage. Naruto took a moment to ponder his response. Honestly, he hadn't thought about his impression of his teammates that much. Sakura was nice enough, he supposed. At the very least, she proved far more pleasant than Naruto had initially thought she would be, which was more his fault than hers. Similarly, Kakashi-sensei was proving himself to be a surprise as well. He came off as a bit of a slouch at times, but he'd actually taught Naruto a lot. As for Sayuri, they're all right, I guess, he answered, hoping the shortness of his answer wouldn't cause any offense. He honestly couldn't think of much else to say. He realized that it was fine when the man nodded in apparent satisfaction. He then pulled what appeared to be a pipe from his desk and packed it with some tobacco. He lit it with a small flame from the end of his finger before inhaling. Naruto could see a visible relaxation in the old man's shoulders, and he exhaled the smoke in a small cloud that hovered briefly around his face before dissipating. Kakashi tells me that you've mastered the multi-shadow clone jutsu, the Hokage continued, causing Naruto to straighten up in his chair. Naruto nodded in confirmation before straightening his posture as he realized he was beginning to lean back in his chair. Thanks for that, by the way. Kakashi-sensei told me you gave him permission to teach it to me. The Hokage waved off his gratitude. There's no need. The speed in which you learned it only confirmed my suspicions about you, he responded. Did you know that my sensei, the second Hokage, created that jutsu? He was also the person responsible for labeling it as forbidden. Yeah, Kakashi-sensei said something about it being dangerous, Naruto clarified. I haven't noticed anything bad so far, though. But now that I've said that, it'll probably kill me tomorrow. The Hokage openly laughed at his reply, which caused Naruto to relax as he realized that the Hokage was actually a pretty laid-back guy. Let's hope not, he replied. Though with chakra like yours, I doubt you'll have any issues. Here it was again, another remark about his chakra. Was it really that abnormal? He'd always known that he had vast reserves. Still, according to Kakashi and the Hokage, he apparently had enough to easily abuse a jutsu that most people would die of exhaustion from even attempting. Have you noticed anything else about it? The Hokage continued, leaning forward a bit. Anything else? Honestly, Naruto thought the jutsu was pretty simple to understand. But clearly, there was more to it than he had initially believed. Was I supposed to? The Hokage waved him for the second time. Don't worry, it's easy to miss. Create a clone, and I will show you. Eager to learn, Naruto was quick to comply. He stood from his chair and formed the hand seal ingrained in his muscle memory over the past week. Shadow Clone Jutsu. In a puff of smoke, a perfect tangible copy stood at his side. The Hokage gave the clone a quick up and down before apparently smiling in approval of the clone's quality. Excellent, he complimented before turning to the clone. Please leave the room and speak with my secretary. Ask her to tell you her name. After you've finished, dispel. Naruto and the clone were equally confused, but the latter nodded in acceptance of the task before leaving the office. He shut the door behind him, leaving Naruto and the Hokage alone. Though technically, even when the clone was there with them, it was still just the two of them. Do clones ever, not want to dispel? Naruto asked. The thought had crossed his mind several times, and he couldn't think of a better person to ask than the professor. The Hokage chuckled at the question, That would present an interesting ethical dilemma, would it not? He responded. No. Clones don't view themselves as individuals. They think of themselves as an extension of an original body. So when they dispel, they're simply returning to their body. Naruto nodded. That made sense and certainly made him feel less conflicted about creating clones only to force them out of existence. It felt the worst when he used them for menial tasks like doing chores, which he was sure someone like Iruka-sensei would call an abuse of the jutsu. Anyway, he was glad that they didn't, otherwise, he'd have to go back to cleaning his apartment on his own. Suddenly, Naruto felt his mind invaded by memories that were not his own. The confusion on his face must have been evident because the Hokage was quick to smirk before exhaling another puff of smoke. What is the name of my secretary, Naruto? He asked as if he knew that he'd know the answer. Fumi, Naruto answered as he recalled asking her. He also recalled the weird look she gave him when he asked. The Hokage nodded. Now do you see? He asked. When a shadow clone was dispelled, the memories of what they experienced were fed onto the user. It was something that seemed so obvious, and yet, Naruto hadn't noticed it at all in the week that he had been using the jutsu. He supposed it was because whenever he used the jutsu, his clones were easting him with stuff that he was doing. So they were simply another viewpoint for something Naruto was already seeing. Yeah, I get it, Naruto responded. Is this what today's meeting was for? Partly, yes, the Hokage explained before looking Naruto directly in the eyes. But more importantly, I need you to complete an important mission, my boy. Naruto's brows raised slightly. A mission without his team. That was certainly strange. What kind of mission? The Hokage smiled, though it was different from the grandfatherly smile that Naruto was accustomed to. I need you to babysit my grandson. One would have been able to hear a pin fall in the office. Babysit, Naruto repeated as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. The Hokage, however, retained his hint of amusement. Yes. I worry about him. He keeps getting into trouble. What kind of trouble? Apparently, not all that concerned about it, the Hokage shrugged. He spends most of his free time either evading his attendance or attempting to innate me. Normal boy behavior, as I'm sure you already know. Did he say innate? Anyway, I think he could use someone like you in his life, the Hokage continued. A role model close to his age would do him quite a bit of good. From the look in the Hokage's eye, it didn't appear that he was being granted the option to decline, so he sighed and reluctantly accepted the mission. As he left the office, he couldn't help but curse his sensei. There was no doubt in his mind that his Kakashi was thrilled to let the Hokage borrow him for the day for something as ridiculous as this. He was probably chuckling about it right now, all the while with that stupid book in his face, no doubt. Back in the office, the Hokage continued smoking his pipe in peace. What a nice young man Naruto Uzumaki had grown to be. According to Kakashi, the boy was somewhat tricky to deal with, but he accepted the mission without much fuss. Still, it was evident that he was upset. He could live with that, though. Besides, Naruto would be grateful for the mission later, though he doubted he'd get any thanks anytime soon. You both need this, the Hokage thought with a warm smile. You just don't know it yet. Morning turned to afternoon, and Naruto found himself waiting outside the academy, a place he hadn't thought much about since his graduation. It was strange. As he watched the rank and file students leaving CL, he felt he was already so different than them, even though it had only been a week since he became a genin. Had he changed that much, or was he always a fish out of water at the academy? Or was he just an arrogant prick, as Sayuri tended to say? This was where Naruto would pick up the boy, Konohamaru, as he was apparently called. Admittedly, a fitting name for a child born from the bloodline of a Hokage. Naruto didn't quite know what his new client looked like, but he'd been told that the staff would bring the boy to him. That was a relief because as he looked into the sea of children, Naruto doubted his ability to even identify someone he knew, let alone someone he didn't. Though, someone who was rather easy to identify was Iruka Sensei, who happened to be Naruto's teacher during his academy tenure. The man weaved through the crowd of children, and as he got closer, Naruto saw what looked like a sheepish look on his face. He immediately felt his stomach sink. "Hey there, Naruto," Iruka greeted with a nervous chuckle. "I hate to be the bearer of bad news, but Konohamaru is missing." Naruto blinked. "Missing?" Iruka had the decency to look a bit embered. "This happens a lot. He'll slip out from under someone's nose to play hooky. A lot of teachers just let him get away with it because he's the third's grandson," he confessed. "The boy reminds me quite a bit of Kiba, actually. And just when I thought I'd finally gotten rid of that stress in my life." "Really?" Naruto groaned. "I was told you'd bring him to me. I don't even know what he looks like." Thankfully, Iruka had apparently considered this problem in advance. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph of a young, angry-looking kid with black eyes and a gray helmet with a hole at the top that revealed spiky brown hair. Admittedly, Naruto had never seen the Hokage without his gray hair and aged skin, so he had to assume that this was what most Sarutobi clan members looked like. "He's a cheeky-looking twerp, isn't he?" he mumbled to himself, which earned an eye roll from Iruka. "You've never been all that normal yourself, Naruto," Iruka countered. Naruto ignored the comment and observed the picture more to commit it to his memory. In all likelihood, he was about to embark upon a wild goose chase of the highest order. Naruto supposed this only made things more entertaining for the Hokage. In fact, he wouldn't be surprised if the old man had known that something like this would happen. It got Naruto thinking. Perhaps this was a test. He was given a high-priority client that he was tasked with protecting. Now, his client was missing, and all he had was a rudimentary understanding of the boy's physical appearance but not much of his routine or personality. Though, it was pretty apparent that Konohamaru was a delinquent of sorts. Who else would skip CL and attempt to murder their own grandfather on a regular basis? Who's someone that might know where he is? Naruto inquired, figuring it would make the most sense to speak with the person most familiar with Konohamaru. Iruka was quick to reply. "That would be Mizuki," he responded, looking somewhat pleased that he was allowed to transfer the burden of this issue onto someone else. "He's actually still here, I think. You can catch him before he leaves if you're quick enough. Try the training grounds. So, to find a kid I've never met before, all I have to do is find an academy instructor I've never met before?" Naruto inquired, causing Iruka to scratch the back of his head and chuckle. "He's got white hair, green eyes, and a bandana for a headband. Outside of that, he wears the same uniform as me," Iruka elaborated, answering the unspoken question. "Not the flashiest looking guy around, but you shouldn't have any trouble finding him." Naruto nodded in thanks before navigating through the crowds of children in the direction of the training ground. It was the part of the academy that he was most familiar with, barring, of course, the CL room where he attended classes for 6 years. Many evenings were spent at the training grounds when everyone else had gone home. Knowing that he was still working while everyone else was sleeping or relaxing gave him a mental edge. When he found Mizuki, he discovered that the man was relaxing under a tree. Upon seeing him, Naruto realized that he recognized the man, having seen him around the academy from time to time. He always came off as a nice enough guy, but that impression was based only on the barest of interactions. "Mizuki-sensei." Naruto spoke up, which alerted the Chunin to his presence. Mizuki smiled kindly and stood to his feet. "Well, if it isn't one of Iruka's students." "Naruto, right," he greeted before gesturing toward Naruto's new headband. "Though I suppose it's former student, now." He extended a hand to shake, and Naruto reciprocated the gesture. I'm looking for Konohamaru Sarutobi, Naruto explained. Iruka-sensei told me that you're close with him. Mizuki seemed to ponder the information before smiling again. Well, I always try to speak with Konohamaru from time to time. You know, I think he appreciates it too. I imagine it must be difficult having to get through every day as the Hokage's grandson. Naruto wasn't one to pee judgment on someone that he'd never met, and yet, he couldn't really follow Mizuki's logic. Being the Hokage's grandson didn't automatically equate to a happy life. Still, it almost seemed like Mizuki was trying to say that his relation to the Hokage caused Konohamaru difficulty. Doubtful. When thinking about what it would be like to live as the grandson of the Hokage, only perks came to mind. Yeah, I bet, Naruto agreed, though it was apparent he didn't. I'm supposed to look after him. It's a mission directly from the Hokage. Can't really do that if I don't know where he is. Mizuki chuckled softly. Then you'll no doubt have your hands full, he replied. Even those of us trained to supervise children have trouble with Konohamaru. He hardly respects authority. But, in the end, you're not much of an authority figure anyway. Maybe that's why Lord Hokage chose you for this mission. Perhaps a different approach is just what Konohamaru has been needing. And here, Naruto thought the Hokage gave him this mission for personal amusement. While he still found that to be more likely than what Mizuki was proposing, it was still an interesting theory. Konohamaru may be more likely to relate to someone closer to his age. However, if he was similar to Kiba, as Iruka-sensei claimed, they shared little in common. You seem pretty invested in all of this, Naruto observed. He's Iruka-sensei's student, not yours. Why do you even care? And he needs to be my student for me to care. Mizuki countered with a raised brow. It's that kind of attitude that leads to children like Konohamaru having trouble in the first place. Iruka is a good man and a good teacher, but sometimes he focuses too much on correcting behavior and not enough on finding the root of the problem. Naruto stuffed his hands into his pockets, and the root of Konohamaru's problems. He's the Hokage's grandson, Mizuki responded as if it were obvious. In his eyes, that's all he is and all he'll ever be. People don't see him for who he is. When the villagers show him respect, they're respecting his status and his lineage, not him. He's a clever boy and has picked up on this. This was all beginning to amount to a load of useless information in the eyes of Naruto. He had no time to continue this conversation, seeing as every moment that went by meant that Konohamaru was possibly getting further and further away. Naruto thought that getting the kid to follow his instructions would be the most challenging part of this mission. And here he was, nearly an hour into it, and he hadn't even found the brat yet. Do you know where he could be or not? If Mizuki was annoyed by the dismissal of his explanation, it didn't show. Clearly, he was a very patient man, which was likely why he appeared to be in the corner of a troublemaker like Konohamaru in the first place. Any other teacher would have likely gotten sick of the bullshit long ago. He tries to act like he hates it, but Konohamaru loves training, Mizuki revealed. I'd try checking the training grounds around the village. With a nod of appreciation, Naruto turned to leave. However, he stopped when he felt a hand placed lightly on his shoulder. Mizuki looked at him with a slight frown. I hope you can find it in yourself to give Konohamaru a chance. You'd be one of the few that has if you do. Naruto honestly didn't know that the academy had such dedicated teachers. Iruka-sensei always seemed to care about his job, but at the end of CL, he appeared just as eager to get home as any student. And here was Mizuki, who seemed his entire life revolved around his students and job. Hell, this whole conversation was about a kid that wasn't even one of his students in the first place. No promises, but I'll try to go there with an open mind, Naruto relented, mostly to appease the man. It seemed to do the trick, as Mizuki smiled kindly once more before removing his hand from Naruto's shoulder. He then nodded in farewell, and Naruto finally left the training ground. Now alone, however, Mizuki's expression shifted into a glare as he watched the blonde Uzumaki walk away. Mizuki supposed plans were made to be changed anyway. Still, this Uzumaki brat was going to be a pain in the. It took Naruto a while, but after searching multiple training grounds, he finally found a kid who matched the photo Iruka-sensei had given him. Konohamaru was currently standing at the center of a clearing, performing the ram hand sign and showing clear signs of exertion on his face. Apparently, Mizuki-sensei was right. The kid did seem to enjoy training. However, based on what Naruto saw, Konohamaru wasn't getting anywhere. So, with his presence still remaining unknown, he searched the ground at his feet until he saw a perfectly intact green leaf. It reminded Naruto of his training as a kid and gave him an excellent idea. So, with that in mind, he finally decided to make his presence known. Making a hand sign and focusing intensely isn't enough to summon your chakra, Naruto commented, causing Konohamaru to nearly jump in shock. It makes it look like you're about to crap your pants. What the? Who the hell are you? Konohamaru demanded, his voice sounding precisely like Naruto expected it to. Squeaky and whiny. Now what was the best way to approach this? Naruto was sure there was probably some really clever way to go about it. For a moment, he even considered keeping the mission a secret since he was confident that the kid probably wouldn't like knowing that his grandfather had ignored him a babysitter. But the kid probably wasn't dumb enough to believe a lie anyway. He eventually decided to be straight up about it. I'm Naruto, and the Hokage tasked me with supervising you, he introduced. Be good, and maybe I'll teach you how to mold that chakra of yours. The boy stared at him, and Naruto nearly smirked as he thought he saw admiration in the boy's eyes. He likely saw his headband and realized he was face to face with someone who could help him get on the fast track to being a shinobi. There was also the possibility that Konohamaru had heard Naruto's name mentioned at the academy. He was kind of a big deal around there, after all. Why would I want advice from a guy named after a ramen topping? The response very nearly made Naruto topple forward. So much for admiration. Maybe because he knows what he's talking about? Naruto questioned with an inquisitive gaze, akin to a fox sizing up a rabbit. You're doing it all wrong. Konohamaru scowled, and it looked like the expression was created with his face in mind. It wasn't quite hatred, but it was certainly a look of burning anger. It made Naruto wonder what the kid was so mad about in the first place. Sure, being the Hokage's grandson probably wasn't all that great all the time, but this kid was as edgy as Sayuri. The only difference was Sayuri hardly spoke, otherwise, Naruto was sure she'd be just as annoying. Naruto smirked. Am I wrong? He asked, causing Konohamaru's brow to furrow even further. Show me what you can do then. Unsurprisingly, the kid didn't need to be asked twice. He lunged at Naruto without hesitation, attempting a punch that was easily avoided. Apparently not lacking in endurance, Konohamaru continued trying attack after attack. However, each proved even less successful than the last. He had the temperament of Kiba but none of the skill. It was almost comical when Naruto thought about it in that way. Hold still, you bastard. Konohamaru roared as he reared his hand back for another telegraphed haymaker. It was predictable enough for Naruto to have time to roll his eyes before catching the fist in his palm. Konohamaru appeared shocked, and before he could react, his wrist was grabbed, and he felt his body become weightless. Time seemed to slow as he was effortlessly flung into the air before slamming onto the ground like a sack of potatoes. In the end, he could do naught but groan. Well, that was something, he heard Naruto casually remark. You tired yet? It was at that moment that Naruto finally understood the sick pleasure that Kakashi derived from humiliating him during the bell test. Rather than continue to taunt him, Naruto approached the now prone boy and crouched in front of his face. He felt pleased when he noticed hints of respect and fear in Konohamaru's eyes. However, it was obvious that the former was inspired by the latter. Not that it mattered. So long as he wasn't irritating, Naruto honestly didn't care. And here I was just trying to help you, Naruto lectured. It's not even a part of my mission, and yet for some reason, I guess I was feeling nice today. Konohamaru groaned, that was you being nice. Yep. Naruto responded before holding out the leaf he had picked up earlier. Here. Something to occupy your time. A leaf. Naruto was confident that Konohamaru had no idea what he was getting at. Konohamaru sat up and rubbed the back of his now aching head. What do I do with it? It's called the leaf concentration drill, Naruto explained in the same way it had been presented to him by Iruka-sensei when he was around Konohamaru's age. You place the leaf on your forehead and focus your chakra onto it, so it stays in place. He was honestly surprised that Iruka-sensei hadn't taught this to Konohamaru yet. It was clear the boy needed it, seeing as though he apparently had trouble concentrating his chakra. Seeing as chakra was literally the foundation of nearly all of the skills a shinobi possessed, it was odd that the kid was being left to figure it out on his own. Iruka-sensei would have probably taught you this a while ago if you didn't skip CL so much, Naruto remarked before handing the leaf over to Konohamaru. Thankfully, the kid accepted without protest. Konohamaru scoffed. I don't need to go to CL to learn how to be a shinobi, he countered before placing the leaf on his forehead. Almost immediately, the leaf fell and fluttered toward the GR at his feet. Before it could reach the ground, Konohamaru bent over and nabbed it out of the air. He glared at the leaf as if it alone was responsible for his failure. He quickly attempted the drill again, resulting in another failure. The display made Naruto smile a bit. Sure, the kid was letting his emotions get the best of him, but at least he kept trying each time he failed. It would only be a matter of time before Konohamaru realized he'd need to calm down and focus if he wanted to succeed. 1 hour later. Damn it! Konohamaru shouted after yet another failure. In the distance, Naruto sat leaning against a tree, staring at Konohamaru with a deadpan expression. He'd thought that the kid would come to his senses and realize that what he was doing wasn't going to work. And yet, an hour had passed, and he still hadn't asked for any advice. Naruto wasn't sure if pride prevented Konohamaru from asking for help or if he was too dense for the thought to cross his mind. Nevertheless, Naruto was losing his patience. The tree wasn't even good for napping on, either. Sounds like someone could use some of Naruto-sensei's sagely knowledge, Naruto spoke up before standing from his seated position. How about it? Konohamaru, who was once again glaring holes into the leaf for what seemed like the 100th time. He was about to reply to the offer with a snarky comment but remembered the kicking he'd just suffered, so he decided to be more respectful. Alright, fine, Konohamaru relented. But I'm not calling you sensei. I think I can live with that, Naruto responded in a laid-back tone before taking the leaf out of Konohamaru's hand. Before you can even try the exercise again, you need to relax. Almost immediately, Konohamaru gave him an incredulous look. Relax, really? That's it, he replied, sounding slightly disappointed. I thought you said you knew how to do this. Naruto simply shrugged. I do, but none of my awesome wisdom will do you any good as you currently are, he explained. The whole point of the drill is to teach concentration. To concentrate, you need to be able to let loose a bit. You said Iruka-sensei was the one who taught you this drill, but he's the most uptight teacher at the academy, Konohamaru responded, clearly a bit skeptical. I bet he's never relaxed for a moment in his life, and he can still do it. So why do I need to? I'm not saying my way is the only way, Naruto elaborated. But it's definitely more fun than how they would teach you at the academy. Despite himself, Konohamaru felt a bit excited. Fun? He asked. How's that? Naruto grinned. Konohamaru's brow twitched in irritation as he was now submerged neck-deep in a hot spring. At his side was Naruto, who seemed to be enjoying the soak far more than he was. This was what Naruto considered to be training. Konohamaru was beginning to wonder if his temporary guardian was using this as an excuse to go to have a soak. Well, this is stupid, Konohamaru snidely remarked with his arms crossed and eyes closed. Konohamaru had expected a reply, but he received none. A bit put off at being ignored, he opened his eyes and leaned closer to his companion, and by stupid, I mean really stupid. Once again, his complaint went unacknowledged. Hey, don't ignore me. Konohamaru then reached to poke Naruto's face but was stopped when faster than he could blink, he was grabbed by the top of his head and pushed underneath the water. It was only for a moment, and Konohamaru was quickly able to get back to the surface. After coughing and rubbing his eyes, he looked at Naruto and saw that he was still leaning against the edge of the hot spring as if he hadn't even moved at all. What the hell? Konohamaru shouted indignantly. You tried to drown me. Naruto's eyes finally opened, and he sighed, I'm gonna be honest here, kid. You're making it pretty hard for me to have a good time right now. After processing the response, Konohamaru nearly felt his eyes pop out of his head. This isn't supposed to be about you having a good time. You're supposed to be helping me figure out this stupid exercise. Naruto rolled his eyes. Geez, you're wound up tight, he critiqued. You're the only person I've ever met who can't relax in a hot spring. It's the whole point of going to one, ya know. I can't see what's so relaxing about taking a bath with a bunch of guys. Konohamaru practically growled. We're the only ones in here, Naruto replied in an exasperated tone, his expression deadpan. Realizing that it wasn't working, Naruto remembered a time when his mentor taught him about the wonders of hot springs. Just thinking back on it made him chuckle a bit under his breath. Back then, he was probably even more of a pain in the than Konohamaru was now. Konohamaru's brows raised in confusion as Naruto stepped out of the water and wrapped a towel around his waist. He gestured for Konohamaru to do so as well, and after a moment of hesitation, the younger boy complied. Naruto then leaned against the wall of the hot spring and placed a finger over his lips to signal that they needed to be quiet. Then, much to the young boy's shock, a kunai seemingly made from solid red energy appeared in the older boy's hand out of thin air. How did you do that? Konohamaru whispered in awe. Naruto shrugged. Don't ask questions. Just watch. Then, somewhat unpredictably, Naruto placed the tip of the kunai into the wooden wall and began twisting it as if he was drilling a hole. The strange red kunai seemed to make quick work of the wood, faster than any standard metal weapon would have been able to. It was once the task was completed that Konohamaru heard it. The giggling. Go ahead and take a look, Naruto casually instructed, with a smirk that made Konohamaru nervous. With each step toward the freshly drilled hole, Konohamaru felt like he was wading through quicksand. His heart thumped rhythmically in his chest. Though, by the way it pounded against his eardrums, it felt as though it was trapped inside of his skull. Konohamaru leaned forward, just to take a peek, and then he would pull away. He didn't trust Naruto, not one bit. Just a quick peek was all he needed. When Konohamaru finally gazed through the hole, his body froze as he looked upon a bounty that he had never known he needed to see. For once, Konohamaru's mind wasn't awash with thoughts, and his body visibly relaxed, causing Naruto to smirk. Is this heaven? After a few more minutes, that to Konohamaru felt like a blissful eternity, he was pulled back from what he had been seeing. Before he could yell in indignation, he was slapped in the forehead. The force of the blow caused him to stagger back a bit, though he managed to maintain his balance before falling into the hot spring. Konohamaru glared harshly. What the hell was that? Naruto interrupted him before he could continue, opting to simply point at his own forehead while smiling smugly. Bright enough to get the message, Konohamaru quickly reached up to his forehead and was shocked by what he felt. A leaf. And not just any leaf, the same damned leaf he had been slaving over all afternoon while trying to master that stupid exercise. He'd done it. Well, what do you know? Naruto remarked. Seems like I was right. Konohamaru could do no more than stare at the infernal leaf as if removing it from his gaze would erase the apparent progress that he had made. Without thought, he placed the leaf on his forehead once more and focused his energy toward it, as he had earlier in his training. This time, however, the leaf did not flutter to the ground, but stayed fixed in place, held by an invisible force. I did it, Konohamaru whispered in wonderment. He then shifted his attention back to Naruto. But how? Naruto shrugged. It's not all that complicated of an exercise, he explained. That hour of training ingrained the drill into you, and now that you've finally relaxed your mind, it was as simple as just trying again. Your brain just needed to catch up with your body. The light of the afternoon sun seemed to shine directly onto Naruto's back, illuminating him as if he were some kind of descended angel. Konohamaru didn't know if he'd go that far. Still, it was apparent that this Naruto guy was more than he had initially seemed. He had a way of explaining things in a way that Konohamaru could understand. Back at the academy, the teachers always spoke as if they were reading straight out of a textbook, but with Naruto, it felt like a genuine conversation. Chakra is formed when you combine your physical and spiritual energy, Naruto continued. You can be as diligent as you want with your physical training, but if your mental training is lacking, you'll never be able to use your chakra and become a real shinobi. Konohamaru was in complete awe as if everything was finally coming together for him. It made so much sense. All this time, he'd only been doing half of what it took to be a shinobi. The realization came with shame as he realized that Iruka-sensei had been trying to teach him this stuff all along. All those days where he'd struggled to try and get his unruly student to attend CL had actually been with his benefit in mind, and he was just throwing it back into his face. Thinking back, Mizuki-sensei had always likened him to a trailblazer, saying there was no one way to becoming a shinobi and that he should embrace his determination to forge his own path. However, it was only now that he realized it was just an excuse to do whatever he wanted. Nobody could learn alone. Even his grandfather had grown up with mentors of his own. It was then that Konohamaru got a fantastic idea. Take me on as your student. Naruto blanked at the request, which came off as more of a declaration than anything else. Huh. Konohamaru sat on his bed, arms crossed and a petulant expression on his face. No matter how many times he begged, Naruto refused to take him on as a student. It was so stupid. That jerk was the one who decided to teach him stuff today, anyway. And now that Konohamaru wanted to learn more, Naruto suddenly didn't have any interest in helping him anymore. He's just like the rest of them, Konohamaru muttered before falling back onto his mattress. For a moment, he had actually tricked himself into thinking that Naruto was someone that cared about him. But once his mission to watch over him finally ended, he seemed almost eager to part ways. Even if he didn't want to be his teacher, he had at least thought that the blonde genin would wish to be his friend. Suddenly, tapping on his window shocked him out of his rumination. After nearly falling out of his bed, Konohamaru looked outside to see Mizuki-sensei of all people sitting on his windowsill. Despite being on good terms with him, Konohamaru was a bit weirded out by the sudden appearance. Sure, they'd talked a lot at the academy, but this was the first time that Mizuki-sensei had sought him out outside of school. Still, Konohamaru had long since recognized Mizuki-sensei as one of the few people who genuinely cared about him, so he opened his window after his brief moment of hesitation. He felt his trust was justified when Mizuki-sensei simply smiled and greeted him without attempting to get inside his room. Sorry to come over so late, but I was too excited to wait to ask you tomorrow, Mizuki confessed, rubbing the back of his head sheepishly. He then grinned in excitement. Well, tell me how your test went. Konohamaru blinked in confusion. Test? What test? Konohamaru felt his stomach churn when Mizuki-sensei simply tilted his head at him, appearing incredibly perplexed. Had he missed something really important today? Upon reaching that conclusion, Konohamaru began to sweat nervously. He could only compare it to someone in CL asking you if you did the homework and then realizing that you'd completely forgotten. Wait, Naruto Uzumaki did chaperone you today, right? Mizuki asked before looking alarmed when Konohamaru nodded in confirmation. Oh, never mind then. The white-haired Chunin then looked as though he was about to scamper off, but a shout of, wait, from Konohamaru was enough to cause him to freeze in place. Konohamaru's hands gripped his bedsheets so tightly that his knuckles turned white. What's going on, Mizuki-sensei? He asked. Please tell me. The lack of an initial response made Konohamaru even more nervous. Mizuki-sensei was always one of the few who were honest with him and told him how it was. Most people were willing to lie to stay on his good side, seeing as he was the grandson of the third Hokage. Look, I'm probably not even supposed to tell you anything about this, Mizuki replied, looking incredibly conflicted. Every year, Lord Hokage chooses the top-ranked prospect from the most recently graduated CL and has them test the skills of a promising student currently enrolled at the academy. If the student performs well, they're allowed to become a genin early. Konohamaru's eyes nearly popped out of his head. So that's what today was about. His grandfather had sent Naruto to test him to see if he was ready to become a genin. It had been a bit suspicious that his grandfather would task a young genin with looking after him. Konohamaru was usually supervised by special jonin that had particular expertise in tutoring children. After coming to that understanding, Konohamaru was crushed to realize that if Naruto was there to test him, he must have failed since he didn't end up being promoted to genin. What had he done wrong? He'd managed to complete the exercise that Naruto tasked him with. He then recalled how he and Naruto had initially fought during their meeting and how he got his kicked with no difficulty. Was that the test? Had Naruto stuck around after and helped him out of pity? Listen, Konohamaru. It's okay, Mizuki continued, sounding as rurring as possible. Most students don't even pee the test anyway. So there's nothing to be ashamed about. You can still become a shinobi. You'll just have to wait and graduate with the rest of your peers. At this point, Konohamaru was at his breaking point. No, damn it. He growled. I have what it takes. There has to be another way to prove that I can do it. In his agitated state, he failed to notice the devious smirk that spread across Mizuki's face. Well, there is one another way. Naruto awoke to a faint tapping on his window. Initially, he thought he had just been hearing things and tried to go back to sleep. However, when the tapping turned to knocking, Naruto groaned and slipped out of bed. Looking toward his clock, he noted that it was already past midnight. Naruto frowned. Who the hell would be banging on his window so late at night? Upon reaching his window, he was surprised to see Iruka-sensei, who looked to be sweating bullets. Naruto rolled his eyes as he realized what was likely going on. He imagined that Konohamaru had probably gotten himself into some kind of trouble. And seeing as Naruto had just spent the entire day with the little brat, he likely would have to get involved. Great. You knocked? Naruto asked after prying his window open, nearly flinching as the chilly evening breeze tickled his skin. Naruto, did anything strange happen while you were with Konohamaru today? Iruka-sensei frantically asked. No, demanded. Naruto sighed upon realizing that his initial assumption had been correct. Not really, he replied before beginning to rub the sleep from his tired eyes. Why? What did he do? He stole the scroll of seals. Naruto nearly tripped over his own feet. He what? Konohamaru lay flat on his back, his body covered with dirt and burn marks. Lying next to him was the forbidden scroll of seals, now opened and unraveled as he had spent the better part of an hour skimming through it. After finally deciding on a jutsu, he trained harder than ever. It was grueling, and there were several points where he felt his recklessness was putting him in danger. However, despite such worries, he continued. This was his last chance, after all. He wouldn't fail. Not again. Huff. 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 That should be enough, Konohamaru remarked after steadying his breath. Now he just needed to wait for Mizuki-sensei. Almost as if things were going according to schedule, Konohamaru heard a faint thud as someone appeared to land in the clearing behind him. He grinned and rolled onto his stomach to tell Mizuki-sensei the good news, but his smile was quickly replaced with a frown when he noticed that his new guest was Naruto, of all people. What are you doing here? He asked, making no effort to conceal his bitterness. Oddly enough, Naruto appeared a bit more serious than usual. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides, and his expression was solemn. Konohamaru also noticed that he looked as though he had just crawled out of bed, as he seemed to have disheveled hair and tired eyes. This caused Konohamaru to look toward the sky, and it was only then that he realized how late it was. You're joking, right? Naruto remarked, his tone sardonic. Also, why midnight? Couldn't you have screwed up during the day when I was already awake? Having enough, Konohamaru sprung to his feet with a surprising amount of vigor for someone who had just been training for hours. But, standing face to face with Naruto now that the truth had been revealed to him, he couldn't be more resentful. Had Naruto come all this way to try and stop him from ping the test? Did he really hate him that much? After standing to his feet, Konohamaru crossed his arms. Oh yeah. Well, guess what? He replied before smiling. I passed the test. I managed to learn a jutsu from the scroll. Now you'll have to get the old man to change his mind and give me that promotion. Naruto's brow furrowed. Test. What the hell are you going on about now? Nothing was more infuriating than someone continuing to lie even though they and the person they were deceiving already knew that the jig was up. Konohamaru felt his nails dig into his palms with enough force to nearly draw blood. It was a different kind of anger than he usually felt. Before, his frustration had no particular target and was directed toward everyone. Now, it was all focused on a single person, which upped the intensity like a flame in the wind. Stop lying to me, Konohamaru shouted, sick of being treated as if he was some kind of idiot. Mizuki-sensei told me all about it, so you can stop pretending. It was always like this. Whether it was Konohamaru's grandfather, Iruka-sensei, Ebisu-sensei, or now Naruto. Everyone led him around by the nose like he was a damn dog. Konohamaru wasn't deemed fit enough to make his own decisions. It was for that reason that his grandfather saddled him with attendants 24/7. It almost felt like he was some kind of prisoner, all because of the family he happened to be born into. Mizuki-sensei. Naruto pondered aloud before he frowned in realization. A shift in the wind caused his back to stiffen, and he was forced to duck to avoid a Fuma shuriken that would have separated his head from his neck. Upon looking over his shoulder, he was unsurprised to see Mizuki perched atop a tree branch, looking decidedly less pleasant than he had when they met earlier in the day. I knew you'd become a problem, Mizuki reflected, his tone laced with venom. I'm not surprised, though. You were born to be a menace. Konohamaru's anger was replaced by frightened confusion. Mizuki-sensei, what's going on? He took a step forward to approach his Chunin instructor, but an extended arm from Naruto halted his advance. The newly minted genin had yet to take his eyes off Mizuki, who was now retrieving another Fuma shuriken from his back. It all but confirmed that he had been the one who attempted to kill Naruto mere moments ago, that is if that wasn't already obvious. You've been duped, kid, Naruto revealed, confirming Konohamaru's fears. This guy's bad news, obviously. The comment caused Mizuki to openly laugh. It was a cruel laugh that made Konohamaru take a half step back in dismay. This wasn't Mizuki-sensei. It couldn't be. Mizuki-sensei wouldn't laugh like that. He wouldn't try to kill someone in cold blood. Funny coming from you of all people, Fox, Mizuki responded, causing Naruto to tense up. Konohamaru. You need to run now, Naruto quickly advised. Don't look back, and don't listen to anything he says. Mizuki smirked cruelly. What? Afraid of your little secret getting out? Quick to action, Naruto unclipped his shuriken punch and unleashed a barrage of sharpened steel. The attack was deftly avoided by Mizuki, who spun around to the other side of the tree branch, allowing it to take the damage intended for him. His laughter echoed throughout the clearing, as it was evident that he didn't register the two children below him as threats. You aren't you? Mizuki taunted before raising his voice. You hear that, Konohamaru? Naruto is keeping secrets from you as well. It's in his nature to deceive people. Konohamaru pushed past Naruto's outstretched arm and clenched his fists in frustration. What are you talking about? He was then stopped when Naruto grabbed his shoulder tightly, yanking him back. Did you not hear what I just told you? He snapped. Get the hell out of here. Now. At this point, Konohamaru was at his breaking point. He struggled wildly in Naruto's grip and eventually managed to wrench himself free, causing him and Naruto to stagger. The blonde looked surprised when he saw the expression of pure hurt plastered over Konohamaru's face. Gone was the childish anger and frustration, as it was replaced with a look of a boy who had been betrayed and didn't know who to trust. Damn it. I'm sick of it. He growled. Stop trying to act like you want me to leave because you care about me, you bastard. You just want me to get lost because you think I'm a nuisance like everyone else. You think that I'll just get in your way. Konohamaru. I can fight too, you know. Konohamaru interrupted. I learned a jutsu from the scroll all by myself. Naruto made to speak again but was forced to lunge forward and push Konohamaru to the ground to protect them both from yet another shuriken thrown by Mizuki. Unfortunately, however, this one had nearly been successful, and Naruto had received a moderately sized cut on his left arm as a reward for getting distracted. If he were an average person, he'd need stitches for sure. He gritted his teeth in pain and glared up at Mizuki with bloodshot eyes that almost trembled with rage. The expression must have been rather intimidating, as it caused Mizuki to briefly pause in surprise. He then shook his head in apparent disgust before the cruel smirk returned to his face. Ah, so you finally begin to reveal yourself. He observed. Now you're almost like I expected you to look, Nine Tails. Upon hearing the odd way that Mizuki addressed Naruto, Konohamaru looked up toward the blonde genin and was shocked at what he saw. The fierce glare. The strange whisker-like marks that until now looked so foreign on his face. It all was beginning to make sense now. Naruto was the Nine Tails. Konohamaru muttered under his breath. Young as he was, Konohamaru wasn't all that familiar with the details of the Nine Tails attack. Nevertheless, he knew that many people died that night, his grandmother included. Even though 12 years had passed since that day, the tragedy was still quite a sore subject. That's right. Naruto is the very beast that killed so many of our people 12 years ago. He's the nine-tailed fox given a human form, Mizuki announced with spiteful glee, confirming Konohamaru's suspicions. He's biding his time, waiting for the perfect opportunity to reveal his true nature so that he can regain his former strength. Was something like that even possible? If it was all true, then Naruto was a hell of an actor. Sure, he was an annoying prick who seemed talented at pissing people off, but he never came off as evil or manipulative. In fact, Konohamaru felt completely comfortable around him. It was one of the reasons that he wanted to become his student. Are you finished? Naruto replied, not sounding all that affected by Mizuki's talk. Suddenly, two glowing red chains seemed to sprout out of Naruto's back, with sharp points at the end that were poised to skewer the mouthy academy instructor. Same as earlier, Mizuki allowed the tree to take the damage in his stead but was shocked when one of the chains managed to pierce through the entirety of the tree, mere inches away from hitting him. This boy was definitely dangerous. The chains vanished into thin air, and two glowing red kunai appeared in Naruto's hands. He held them in a reverse grip and seemed prepared to leap into action. However, he was stopped before he could manage. Naruto noticed an extreme, almost unnatural heat radiating from behind his back. He turned over his shoulder to see Konohamaru, who seemed to be the source of the odd change in temperature. Konohamaru appeared mostly normal, with the only oddity being the smoky vapor that seemed to emit from his skin. His eyes, however, were what Naruto noticed first. The pupils and whites of his eyes were gone, replaced entirely by an orange color that seemed to flicker like a flame. Naruto soon took an involuntary step back as the heat appeared to increase. The gr around them began to wither away into ash, and Naruto could feel his skin begin to sting. I told you that I learned a new jutsu, Konohamaru declared, with smoke escaping from his mouth. My mistake caused this, so let me handle it. I can take him. Naruto was conflicted. Kid. Stubborn as always, Konohamaru grinned. If I kick this guys, you'll have no choice but to take me on as your student. Right, boss. Before Naruto could voice any approval or opposition, Konohamaru burst into action, leaping toward Mizuki's perched position. His every movement seemed to scorch anything unfortunate to come close to his body. Both Mizuki and Naruto were equally shocked by the display of physical prowess. What was this jutsu? It was clearly forbidden for a reason, as the collateral damage had the potential to be devastating. Mizuki was forced to abandon his hiding spot to create more distance. Konohamaru continued to pursue relentlessly, appearing slightly demonic with his fiery eyes and almost glowing skin. Realizing that a hand-to-hand clash would be suicide, Mizuki unleashed a Fuma Shuriken at his new opponent. Konohamaru dodged the projectile and lunged forward with even greater speed. He opened his mouth and roared, releasing a torrent of flames from the pit of his stomach. To avoid being burned by the fire, Mizuki dove down and landed at the center of yet another clearing. Konohamaru quickly caught up, and the two finally stood face to face. It was the first time since Mizuki's betrayal that Konohamaru was really given a good opportunity to look him in the eye. He saw malice, jealousy, anger, and, most prevalent now, fear. Konohamaru was strong now, strong enough to make someone like Mizuki afraid. And yet, he felt no pleasure or pride. Only sadness and regret. The woods surrounding them had caught fire in the wake of Konohamaru's last ult. Mizuki frantically observed his surroundings as he tried to identify some means of getting away. At this point, he didn't even want the scroll anymore. He'd be happy enough if he could just escape with his life. Finally, realizing that there was no escaping, he lost hope. Listen, Konohamaru, I'm sorry that I lied to you, but you need to believe me when I tell you that everything I've ever said to you is true, Mizuki said. All those days together at the academy. Remember, I always was able to see things in you that other people couldn't. I was able to realize your potential. Konohamaru scowled. All you ever did was convince me that I didn't need to change, that I was too special to listen to anyone else, he countered. You wanted me to think there were shortcuts to becoming a shinobi, all so you could trick me. A wave of pain suddenly coursed through Konohamaru's body, causing him to nearly visibly flinch. The jutsu was painful, which was something he learned the hard way when learning it. He had to continually regulate the heat flowing throughout his body. If at any moment Konohamaru lost control, he would be burned alive from the inside. Still a novice, there were brief moments when he would lose control, and the pain was unbelievable. Mizuki raised his hands to placate. You're right, Konohamaru. You're right. There aren't any shortcuts. I see that now. I wanted to use the scroll to become powerful, but you've shown me the error of my ways. From now on, I'll work hard, like you. His response was obviously made in an attempt to get out of his current predicament. However, even still, Konohamaru shifted his attention to the ground in apparent doubt. Seeing this as his opportunity, Mizuki began to approach the younger boy. The closer he got, the more and more discomfort he felt due to the unnatural heat that emanated from Konohamaru's form. Still, Mizuki endured it through gritted teeth. He needed Konohamaru to trust him again. However, before he could get close enough, Konohamaru's head shot back up, with a look of determination gracing his features. Naruto taught me something that you never could, Mizuki-sensei. If not for him, I would have never discovered what it really means to be a shinobi, Konohamaru declared, much to Mizuki's chagrin. Even if he really is the nine-tailed fox, he's still a better person than you'll ever be. Mizuki seemed to be momentarily stunned by Konohamaru's words. For the longest time, he had Konohamaru wrapped around his finger. Everything was going well, and then that bastard Nine Tails came into the picture and screwed everything up. He supposed the generational disconnect was to blame. Someone Konohamaru's age couldn't possibly fathom the destruction caused by the Nine Tails. You're making a mistake, Konohamaru. Can't you see? Mizuki warned. You're throwing your lot in with the devil. Konohamaru shook his head and grinned. You're the one who's wrong, Mizuki-sensei. You. Before Konohamaru could finish, he was forced to involuntarily grip his chest in pain. He collapsed onto his knees and began to hyperventilate. With each breath, he appeared to radiate more and more heat, and Mizuki was forced to take several steps back to avoid being burnt by mere proximity. After creating a safe distance, Mizuki couldn't help but smirk at the sight. The kid had been so why not even a minute ago? I guess it doesn't really matter who's right. Konohamaru. Mizuki mocked, though it was likely that his words fell on deaf ears. Konohamaru's back then arched in an agonizing display. He let out a silent scream, and his body began to glow so intently that Mizuki could see the veins underneath his skin. The flame in his eyes grew more intense, flickering and poised to burn his flesh. Finally, when Mizuki began to see a deep fiery color emitting from Konohamaru's mouth, he realized what was about to happen and prepared to jump away. However, before Konohamaru, and likely Mizuki as well, were incinerated in the explosion, a glowing red chain emerged from the treeline. The chain coiled around Konohamaru's body, and almost immediately, the heat and the sensation of impending dread vanished. Konohamaru's body reverted to normal, though his skin was now singed and deeply red as if he had a bad sunburn. Once the crisis appeared to have been averted, the chain returned to where it had come from. Konohamaru collapsed onto the ground, now unconscious. Shortly after, out of the shadows and the flickering flame of the forest, Naruto appeared. Mizuki watched him advance with caution. The forest was still burning, and unless he was willing to run through fire, it would be difficult to escape while being pursued. To make matters worse, the rising smoke would no doubt attract the attention of those searching for the missing scroll, so he'd need to act quickly. He'd have to kill the Nine Tails brat here and now. Naruto showed little interest in Mizuki and instead chose to ignore the Chunin in favor of checking Konohamaru's pulse. Seizing the opportunity, Mizuki removed the last of his remaining Fuma shuriken from his back and aimed for Naruto's blind spot. Once that was successful, he'd kill Konohamaru, cut his losses, and escape. Sure, he'd failed in his endeavor, but now he'd live to fight another day. Mizuki threw his weapon, watched it along its path, and grinned in anticipation as it inched closer and closer to its target. However, the blood drained from his face when Naruto inexplicably reached out and plucked the spinning projectile out of the air. Mizuki observed Naruto's outstretched arm and was appalled when he saw that the boy's nails had elongated and sharpened, almost resembling claws. Naruto then looked over his shoulder, and any remaining will to fight abandoned Mizuki. He found himself face to face with a pair of crimson eyes that burned with unspeakable fury. They were slitted, not unlike the eyes of a feline, and they were a sight that would be recognizable to anyone alive during the Nine Tails attack. The Nine Tails. The words came out of Mizuki's mouth as a hushed whisper that more than adequately reflected his terror. Naruto then stood to his feet, finally granting Mizuki his full attention. The boy's whisker-like marks were now thickened and more pronounced, as if they'd been roughly carved into his cheeks with a knife. His expression was that of contempt and thinly veiled fury. It made the situation even more terrifying, as his rage appeared to be controlled and calculated. "You think that I'm a monster?" Naruto remarked, and Mizuki shuddered as the eerie sound of his voice violated his ears. "Would it bring you some comfort to be proven right in the end?" Mizuki opened his mouth, perhaps to beg for mercy, but no words managed to escape his lips. Then, in the blink of an eye, Naruto vanished in a burst of speed, and everything went black. Hours later, Naruto observed Konohamaru's unconscious form and frowned. After dispatching Mizuki, he immediately grabbed Konohamaru in his arms and rushed him to the hospital. The staff promptly snatched the boy out of his hands and brought him to the intensive care unit. It took a while before Naruto was given more information. Still, after what felt like hours, he was finally allowed to see him. The brat was still alive, but there was no telling whether or not his injuries would have any lasting effects. From what Naruto had been told so far, Konohamaru had apparently found some way to use nature transformation to convert his chakra into fire. So, essentially, he turned his body into an oven and nearly exploded from the inside. The little bastard was lucky to be alive. It would seem that my reckless curiosity is hereditary. The new voice surprised Naruto, who nearly jumped out of his seat as he turned to see who it was. He saw the Hokage himself, looking over his grandson with an almost weary smile. Naruto stood out of the way to give the Hokage some space to be with his grandson, but was stopped when the elderly man gestured for him to sit back down. After returning to his seat, Naruto's brows furrowed as he pondered what the Hokage had said. "What do you mean by hereditary?" The Hokage chuckled as if recalling an amusing memory. "I found myself in a similar position back when I was an inquisitive youth," he confessed. "I had always thought that if someone were to steal this particular forbidden jutsu, it would be one of my enemies, but to think it would be my own grandson. It makes me regret creating it in the first place." "You created that jutsu?" Naruto asked, his eyes widening in surprise. The Hokage did his best to look offended. "Don't look so shocked, my boy. I am the Hokage. I've developed many jutsu over my lifetime, forbidden or otherwise. That was fair. One didn't earn the moniker of the professor unless they possessed both the ability to master ninjutsu and create their own." But still, Naruto had always viewed the Hokage as a sagely figure, so imagining him using such a destructive jutsu felt almost uncharacteristic. It would be like finding out that Sayuri collected postage stamps or knitted sweaters. Okay. Now that he thought about it, that was definitely a bit of an exaggeration, but still. "Then you'd know more than anyone how dangerous it is," Naruto remarked before shifting his attention back to Konohamaru. "Is the kid gonna be okay?" Were his eyes still on the Hokage, he'd have seen the man smiling at him fondly. "Worried about your new disciple?" he asked in a knowing voice. Naruto frowned at the idea. Disciple. The responsibility still didn't seem all that appealing. Yet, he couldn't help but admire Konohamaru's determination. The kid had nearly burned himself alive, trying to prove he was worthy. In a way, he felt honored. If he were weak or untalented, a kid like Konohamaru wouldn't have been interested in learning from him. "I understand the burden of mentorship very well, perhaps more so than anyone," the Hokage continued. "I've produced success stories, utter failures, and everything in between. It weighs heavy on your shoulders, let me tell you. How am I qualified to teach anyone?" Naruto responded with a shoulder shrug. "I've only just graduated from the academy. It was you who taught him how to mold his chakra, was it not?" The Hokage inquired. You succeeded where the academy failed. You somehow managed to grab my grandson's attention and keep it. That takes skill, my boy. Naruto smiled sardonically. All I did was teach him the same way I was taught. And what's so wrong with that? The Hokage asked with a shrug. All knowledge has to originate from somewhere. I was undoubtedly influenced by my teachers while teaching my own students. The goal of a teacher is to find a way to impart their knowledge to the next generation. How you do so isn't what's most important. Naruto mulled over the Hokage's words and shifted his attention back to Konohamaru. He couldn't help but feel responsible. Had he accepted the kid's request and agreed to become his teacher, Mizuki probably wouldn't have been able to trick him into stealing the scroll. A young boy had reached out to him seeking guidance, and he rejected him because he couldn't be bothered. I'm told that Konohamaru won't wake up for at least a couple of days, the Hokage remarked while placing a comforting hand on Naruto's shoulder. Use that time to think about what you'll say to him when he finally does. The Hokage chose that as his moment to leave. In the grand scheme of things, his visit hadn't been all that long, but he was a busy man, and at this point, Konohamaru's life was no longer at risk. Still, short as it was, Naruto was grateful for him stopping by. The Hokage had a way of saying a lot while only saying a little. Today, Naruto was lucky enough to be at the receiving end of some of his legendary wisdom. For the first time, he truly understood why that man was the Hokage. Hokage. The position had always fascinated him, even during his early years. The greatest heroes in the history of the village all held the position at some point. In fact, the third Hokage was the only one to retire outside of battle, while all the others died protecting the village somehow. And yet, once the fourth Hokage died, the third was required to take the hat once more. It was as if the universe was telling him that he wasn't destined for a normal death. He was the Hokage, after all. Looking back toward Konohamaru, he felt himself overtaken by a sense of certainty. Until this point, it had been nothing but doubts, but after hearing what the Hokage had to say, he was beginning to warm up to the idea of taking on a student. Sure, Konohamaru had already proven to be a pain in the. Still, in Naruto's experience, interesting people were seldom able to stay out of trouble. Alright, you stubborn little brat, Naruto remarked as if Konohamaru could hear him. I'll train you. However, a true teacher wouldn't let today's events be so easily forgotten. Yes, he'd have to find a suitable punishment. He was almost tempted to ask Kakashi since the masked Jonin seemed to have a knack for humiliating bratty children. The thought made Naruto smirk deviously. Eavesdropping from outside the hospital room, the Hokage smiled warmly before finally leaving. Maybe today hadn't entirely gone as he'd planned, an understatement, but things still ended up fine in the end. When Sayuri arrived at the bridge, she was unsurprised to see Naruto already waiting there. She nearly scowled. She and Naruto had an unspoken competition for who would arrive at team meetings first. For the most part, they were both pretty consistent. One day she'd be first, and the next, he'd be first. But today was the first time that one of them had been first twice in a row. He was doing it to piss her off, and no, she definitely wasn't overthinking it. Sayuri observed the meeting place and nearly rolled her eyes at Kakashi's predictable absence. She was beginning to wonder how Kakashi held the rank of Jonin in the first place. He was undoubtedly skilled enough as a fighter. Still, it seemed as though he was pretty unreliable when it came to just about everything else. Someone who couldn't show up on time couldn't be counted on to complete our S-ranked missions. Good morning, Naruto greeted once he noticed her. Sayuri raised a brow at the admittedly unusual display. Ever since their fight 1 week prior, the two hadn't quite been on speaking terms, not that they ever really were in the first place. There wasn't any notable animosity, but there was certainly an ample amount of awkwardness. During their training exercise against Team 8, they were able to cooperate for the moments they were together. Still, they were quickly separated the moment the action began. There was no telling how well they'd work together on an actual mission. Yet, no matter how hard she tried to forget, she couldn't purge the image of his glare out of her mind. For a brief moment, it looked as though he would like nothing more than to strangle her to death with his bare hands. It was so unlike him. Naruto was always the one being annoying or pissing someone off. So seeing him get mad about something was like watching a fish walk out of a river and do the waltz. Seeing no reason to ignore him, Sayuri replied, albeit tersely, "Morning." With greetings out of the way, Sayuri found a place against the bridge's railings and leaned back. Kakashi was probably going to take a while to arrive anyway, so she decided to at least get comfortable. It got her thinking, why the hell did she, Naruto, and Sakura even arrive on time in the first place? If they knew Kakashi would be an hour late, they should probably arrive late themselves. Though, knowing Kakashi, he'd probably choose to arrive on time the moment they tried. Sitting on top of the bridge's railing, Naruto began humming in a way that made Sayuri want to rip her hair out. God, he was so damn annoying. Of course, it was no accident. Even since they'd met, it seemed like he was acquiring data on her, figuring out what made her tick so that he could render her constantly upset or frustrated. It was cerebral, making her feel like some little kid whose buttons could be pressed easily. You're not going to believe this, Naruto suddenly began, causing Sayuri to preemptively sigh in preparation for whatever ridiculous thing he was about to say. But I became a teacher recently, ya know. A teacher? What the hell was he talking about? Naruto continued with a smile. So that would make me Naruto-sensei now. Pretty cool, right? Sayuri gave Naruto a suspicious side-eyed glance. You're right, I don't believe it. Who the hell would actually want to be your student anyway? Naruto lurched back over the railing as if he had just been struck in the face. I'll have you know that I have a lot of skill and knowledge to pee on. There isn't a student in the academy who wouldn't accept training from the great Naruto-sensei. Clearly unimpressed, Sayuri could only bring herself to roll her eyes at his stupidity. Replying to Naruto at this point would be tantamount to encouraging his foolish ramblings. For too long, she had been lowering herself to his level, allowing him to get under her skin and influence her mood. Well, no longer. From this point onward, she'd be an adult and simply ignore the mindless drivel that came out of his mouth. Try rolling your eyes again. Maybe you'll actually find a brain back there this time. Sayuri felt her jaw clench at the insult. When Sakura finally got to the bridge, she was amused to see Naruto and Sayuri bickering. The atmosphere was charged with such an incredible tension that their glares appeared to generate electricity that arched back and forth between their eyes, causing sparks to fly. Sakura rubbed her tired eyes, and when she looked back, the sparks were gone, but Naruto and Sayuri were still very much at each other's throats. Having long since learned that there was no point trying to get in between them whenever they got like this, Sakura simply chose her spot on the bridge and leaned back in preparation for when Kakashi would finally arrive. As she watched Naruto and Sayuri argue, she couldn't stop the smile from spreading across her face. Perhaps it had all been in her head, but recently she had felt a strange tension between them. She was perceptive enough to notice that Kakashi-sensei had also detected the friction. Still, as usual, he kept out of their personal affairs. Sakura wasn't sure if their sensei's hands-off approach made him a good teacher or a bad one. On the one hand, it was the squad leader's responsibility to ensure that their team was a cohesive unit. Still, on the other, if Kakashi-sensei was always solving all of their problems, they wouldn't be able to function during missions without him. They're so cute, aren't they? Sakura felt her spine jolt, and her body became stiff as a board at the unexpected voice behind her. She slowly turned to see Kakashi crouched on the bridge railing with a level balance and concentration that appeared odd from such a lazy person. He gave her a casual wave as if he hadn't just scared her half to death, and she returned the gesture with a timid nod before turning back to her teammates. Due to their quarrel, Naruto and Sayuri hadn't detected the arrival of their sensei. Though the more likely explanation was that Kakashi-sensei was the type of person you didn't notice unless he wanted you to. She wondered if all Jonin were terrifying in that way. The idea that she was standing so close to someone so far above her in terms of skill was rather daunting. Are we finally going on a mission today, sensei? Sakura asked as they continued to observe the bickering duo. Kakashi nodded. Yep, I just met with Lord Hokage. Our client is waiting for us at the front gate as we speak. Then shouldn't we head over there now? Sakura asked, sounding somewhat perplexed. Maybe in a minute, Kakashi muttered. Don't you enjoy watching those two bond together? Sakura sighed. Sometimes it felt like she was the only sane person on her team. After packing their bags for their journey, Team 7 ventured to the front gates, where they would finally meet their client. Apparently, he was a master bridge builder from a country called the Land of Waves who needed to be escorted back home safely. It was a standard C-rank mission. At most, they'd have to contend with a couple of bandits, and even then, the sight of a shinobi escort was usually enough to ward off such thugs. Secretly, Sayuri was hoping some bandits would be stupid enough to test them. She was itching for a real life or death scenario that would test her mettle as a shinobi. Her spar with Naruto had been enough to get her blood pumping, but at no point did she feel her life was at stake. Sayuri, more than anything, wanted to put her life on the line. She wanted to know how she would react. All right, we'll be there in a few minutes, Kakashi announced as if his squad had never been to the front gate. He then shifted his attention to Naruto and Sayuri in particular. Be good, you two. Naruto tried his best to look offended, and what about Sakura? He asked. To her credit, Sakura had the decency to blush at all the attention suddenly coming her way. Sakura is the only one among you with any semblance of manners, Kakashi explained, rather bluntly. You seem to enjoy pushing people's buttons, and Sayuri doesn't seem to enjoy people at all. Accurate as that accusation may have been, Sayuri couldn't help but scowl. Was she seriously being lumped in with Naruto, of all people? A couple minutes passed before she then felt the blonde in question nudging her on the arm in an attempt to get her attention. Despite her better judgment, she obliged. Worried? He asked with a grin. Sayuri frowned. What's there to be worried about? She replied, rather dismissively. Naruto shrugged before placing his hands behind his head. You aren't all that tough to read, he explained. You're worried that this mission will be a waste of time. Confirming or denying Naruto's suspicions was precisely what he wanted, so Sayuri decided that ignoring him was the best bet. He was kind of right, though. One of her biggest concerns about becoming a genin was the possibility that she'd have to waste her time on pointless missions. Escorting some guy back to his shitty little town wasn't something that got her blood pumping. When they finally arrived at the front gate, Sayuri couldn't help but curl her lip in disgust when she got her first look at the client. He was a fairly old, gray-haired, bespectacled man, in his late 50s to early 60s, with a bushy beard and dark eyes. It wasn't his appearance that Sayuri found to be repulsive, though. Instead, it was the fact that he seemed to think that now was the appropriate time to down an entire bottle of booze. It didn't help that most of it was dribbling into his beard. Are you Mr. Tazuna? Kakashi inquired once they were within speaking distance of the client. The client seemed perplexed as if he didn't even remember that he had hired a team of shinobi in the first place. Things eventually appeared to click in his head, and he tossed his now empty liquor bottle to the side before stumbling forward to get a better look at his escorts. He adjusted his glees before giving every member of Team 7 a brief glance over. I paid for shinobi, not a bunch of brats, Tazuna complained. Is this the best the Hidden Leaf has to offer? Sayuri was suddenly tempted to show the old bastard what she had to offer him. On the other hand, Kakashi didn't seem at all affected by the blatant disrespect. "My team is more than qualified to handle a simple escort mission, Mr. Tazuna," he urged. "But if that doesn't put you at ease, I'll have you know that I'm a Jonin with plenty of experience. You're in capable hands." Tazuna didn't appear convinced. "I'm a famous bridge builder, you know. A lot of people would cry if something happened to me." Sayuri tuned out the rest as they skipped through the remainder of the greetings before finally pinging through the front gates. It was the first time Naruto and Sakura had ever left the village, so it was quite a big moment. Yet, their responsibilities didn't give them much opportunity to soak it all in. Although, Naruto did hang back for a moment to fully grasp the milestone before catching back up with the rest of the group. It was interesting seeing Naruto being sentimental. There was definitely more to him than initially met the eye. Sayuri supposed that was normal. Nobody was the same all the time, and Naruto and Kakashi seemed to have that in common. They had a talent for presenting themselves as one thing while being something completely different altogether. It made her wonder which Naruto was the real Naruto. As their journey commenced, the scenery was fairly consistent. Despite having left the village at their backs some time ago, there were still forests as far as the eye could see. They stuck to the same dirt road and rarely stopped for any breaks. Tazuna had been strangely quiet since their departure, and it was beginning to make Sayuri nervous. Whenever people started acting out of character, that was usually the time to get worried. It was only after reaching that conclusion that she noticed that Naruto was staring intently at something on the road as they sped. She followed his gaze and was confused when she discovered that it was a simple puddle that seemed to captivate his attention. It took a moment for the implication of a puddle being on the road during spring to settle in her mind before she recognized the danger. Having taken notice of the puddle first, Naruto attempted to voice his concerns. "Sensei." However, two shadowy figures burst out of the puddle before he could finish what he was saying. They wore clawed gauntlets on their left and right hands, respectively, which were linked together by a lengthy serrated chain. Sayuri watched the duo as they leapt toward Kakashi with startling quickness. Unfortunately, he was too slow to react, and before anyone could make a move, Kakashi was ensnared by the chains. Once their target was caught, the two aliens spoke, "One down." Team 7 watched as their sensei was shredded to pieces with a sickening noise. Sakura's anguished cries served as a signal for Sayuri to rush into action. Their squad leader was dead, but that didn't mean the mission was over. They still needed to protect the bridge builder. Speaking of which, after killing Kakashi, the murderous duo was now shifting their attention to Tazuna. Before any harm could befall the client, Sayuri threw a kunai that pinned the chain to a nearby tree. In a flash of speed, Sayuri jumped into the air and landed on both gauntlets. Before the would-be-ins could react, she grabbed the gauntlets in her hands and kicked them each in the face. The force of her attack was enough to knock the duo back and even detach the chain from their gauntlets. It was a bittersweet development, as while their opponents were deprived of one of their weapons, they were also free to move independently of the other. Despite the small victory, there was no respite in action. Now that they were separated, the ins split up to attack different targets. One stayed put and began to engage Sayuri in hand-to-hand combat. At the same time, the other charged toward Tazuna with murderous intent. When Sakura realized she was the only thing standing between the enemy and the client, she felt a surge of fear. She supposed it was justifiable, given the circumstances, but she cursed her timidity all the same. Once her body came to terms with the fact that it was now or never, she steeled her nerves. She drew a kunai from her weapon pouch before lowering into a defensive position. "Stay behind me, sir," she warned, sounding as rattled as Tazuna looked. Then, just as the enemy was within arm's reach, an orange blur sailed into Sakura's line of vision. Naruto kneed the in the face, launching him into the woods and effectively saving Sakura and Tazuna both. Before Sakura could even think to voice her appreciation, Naruto lunged in the very same direction he had sent the enemy flying. It wasn't long before Naruto vanished into the trees as well. Meanwhile, Sayuri was still fighting with the other in, and having the time of her life no less. At that moment, she couldn't even remember that Kakashi had just been killed before her eyes. Her instincts had taken over as she delved into the deepest pit of her baser impulses. This was the kind of battle she had been searching for. These were the stakes that she wanted. Her fun was suddenly interrupted when Kakashi appeared out of nowhere, instantly snatching the enemy into his arm. The grip must have been incredibly tight, as the enemy quickly gasped for breath before losing consciousness. Sayuri wasn't sure whether she should be relieved that Kakashi was alive or disappointed that the fighting was over. So, in the end, she settled for an odd mixture of both. Kakashi-sensei, Sakura shouted before pointing into the adjacent woods. Naruto's in the woods fighting one of those shinobi. Sayuri watched as Kakashi's lone eye stealed over. Sayuri, tie him up, he commanded rather simply before dropping the unconscious body of the enemy shinobi onto the ground like a sack of potatoes. Kakashi vanished in a puff of smoke, presumably en route to wherever Naruto was located. After he left, Sayuri reached into her weapon pouch and retrieved a spool of shinobi wire. It was a handy tool, perhaps one of her favorites. During training, she'd regularly use wires to direct her shuriken midair. It was like flying a kite, now that she thought about it. As she began tying up the enemy, she felt Sakura and Tazuna approaching from behind. Are you alright, Sayuri? Sakura inquired with apparent concern in her tone. I'm fine. Tazuna, on the other hand, looked upon Sayuri with awe. Good work, kid, he complimented while still trying to calm his nerves. You definitely earned your pay just then. Sakura bobbed her head in agreement. You reacted so fast. She said in adoration. You and Naruto both. In truth, Sayuri hadn't even noticed Naruto in that action. She'd been so focused on handling her business that she didn't catch a glimpse of how he reacted. Based on what Sakura said, he apparently started fighting the other in, and the two ended up somewhere in the woods nearby. Still, seeing as Sayuri was the first to take action, she viewed it as her victory. Naruto got second place, which wasn't bad, but it wasn't first. Since she wasn't a complete jerk, Sayuri also offered Sakura some praise. Good job staying with the client. You're better than I thought. She instantly regretted doing so when Sakura blushed in response. It was supposed to just be a simple compliment, and Sakura looked like she'd just been commended by the Hokage himself. Embered at the attention, Sayuri averted her gaze and continued tying up the would-be in. Sayuri took the time to observe their new captive. He had wild shoulder-length brown hair and dark eyes. In terms of clothing, he wore a camouflage suit with bandages around his waist and dark-colored knee-length shinobi sandals. Most distinct, however, was the rebreather covering the lower half of his face and the sizable clawed gauntlet he wore on his left arm. What village does this symbol represent? Sayuri thought to herself as she observed his headband. She decided to turn to Sakura once more. Sakura, what village uses this symbol on their headbands? Sakura leaned over Sayuri's shoulder and squinted. I think that must be the Hidden Mist village, right? That's right, Sakura. The two girls were surprised to hear Kakashi's voice from behind them. When they turned to face him, Sakura flashed a bright smile when she saw that Naruto was standing at his side, looking completely unharmed. Sayuri's attention, however, was more fixated on the body that Kakashi was carrying on his shoulder. It was the other in, no doubt, and based on the deep bloody gash along his neck and his pale complexion, Sayuri deduced that he was dead. Had Kakashi killed him? These two were Chunin from the Hidden Mist, Kakashi explained, correcting himself halfway as he seemed to recall the corpse draped over his shoulder. The Hidden Mist Village, EH. It didn't take a genius to figure out that the Hidden Mist Village was associated with the Land of Water. So what brought them all the way to the Land of Fire? And, perhaps even more importantly, why were they targeting a random bridge builder? Sayuri eyed their client with thinly veiled suspicion. Clearly, there was more to this man than met the eye. Kakashi appeared to be following the same line of thought. I pretended to be killed so that I could learn who those shinobi were targeting, he revealed before leveling a stern gaze Tazuna's way. It seemed like they were after you, Mr. Tazuna. Tazuna looked down at the ground in apparent shame. We haven't heard anything about you being targeted by shinobi, Kakashi said. This mission was supposed to be protection from bandits, thieves, and the like. But to be faced with Chunin-level shinobi, that's beyond the scope of our mission agreement. So you had better have a good excuse for lying in your mission request, Mr. Tazuna. Sakura nodded in agreement. We aren't ready for this kind of mission, sir, she said, taking on a sympathetic tone. We should turn back. While she agreed that the client should be held responsible for lying, Sayuri wasn't at all on with Sakura's desire to abandon the mission. Just now, she had been gifted with a fantastic opportunity. With the possibility of engaging in such a battle once more, she wasn't about to head back home. I think we should keep going, sensei, Naruto chimed in, earning a look of shock from Tazuna. I mean, it's not like anyone was hurt or anything. Kid, the bridge builder muttered. Kakashi sighed. Naruto, there's a reason missions have specific ranks, he explained. It's so shinobi are given missions that align with their qualifications. You three have only been genin for a week. You shouldn't be led anywhere near a B-rank mission like this. Sayuri frowned. Kakashi was making it sound like they hadn't handled the ambush incredibly well. As Naruto said, nobody was injured, and the aliens couldn't even touch the client. If those two hidden mist shinobi were Chunin, Sayuri was confident she could handle opponents at that level. And, if his impressive display was anything to go by, Kakashi would also make quick work of them. I agree with Naruto, Sayuri said, earning a look of surprise from Tazuna and one of dismay from Sakura. We can handle anything that's thrown our way. Sayuri glanced back in Naruto's direction and saw him give her a thumbs up. She rolled her eyes, unsure if he was messing with her or if he was genuinely grateful for her taking his side. Either way, it wasn't like she seconded his opinion because she wanted to have his back. No, she had her own reasons for wanting to continue with the mission, and none included Naruto. Geez, looks they're pretty set on this, Sakura, he remarked to his only sensible student. Very well, we'll continue, for now, at least. Tazuna was pleased by the development, seeing as he ensured that he'd live for at least another day. He informed his escorts that they'd be nearing the coast soon and that he'd arranged transportation to the Land of Waves. With that, they continued on their journey. During their ferry ride to the island, they traveled silently through the fog. It was then that Tazuna finally revealed his nation's plight. A wealthy businessman named Gato had taken over the Land of Waves and essentially made it his own. Anyone who resisted was put down. As a result, the Land of Waves was in a state of abject poverty, with only Tazuna's bridge serving as a hope for a better future. After hearing his story, not even Kakashi objected to continuing their mission. Upon their arrival in the Land of Waves, Team 7 was initially dropped off at a pier in a standard-looking fishing village. It was situated adjacent to the water and was interconnected by various docks and walkways. It was rather large, actually, and was incredibly beautiful. Yet, they didn't stay for long, as apparently Tazuna's home was further inland. It wasn't long before they were navigating through woodland paths once more. The terrain was very similar to the Land of Fire, which was to be expected since the two nations were so close. However, a distinct difference was that the Land of Waves felt wetter, for lack of a better word. The air seemed saturated with water, and the ground was almost moist underfoot. Sayuri felt the environment was actually soothing on her skin and closed her eyes for a brief moment of relaxation. Suddenly, the sound of something splitting through the air alerted the members of Team 7. Kakashi quickly shouted a warning before tackling Tazuna to the ground. Just in the nick of time, a Miv cleaver-like sword spun directly where the aging bridge builder had been standing. Sayuri's eyes tracked the blade as it continued on its course before it eventually embedded itself in a tree. I didn't even hear it coming until the last possible moment, she internally chastised, realizing that her momentary lack of focus could have gotten herself killed. A man suddenly appeared in a flicker of movement, standing on the blade's hilt. He struck an imposing figure with short, spiky black hair, grayish skin, and dark brown eyes. He wore bandages that covered the bottom of his face, similar to Kakashi. He was shirtless with a pair of striped pants with white leopard printed leg and hand warmers. Sayuri's eyes quickly gravitated to his headband, which he sported sideways, and recognized the symbol of the hidden mist. She then looked to Hu-sensei, who hardly seemed intimidated. Well. If it isn't Zabuza Momochi, he remarked, revealing the name of their enemy. If I'm not mistaken, you're a rogue shinobi from the Hidden Mist village. Zabuza appeared to smirk underneath his mask. To think that my name carries weight even in the land of fire, he replied. And it's especially flattering coming from someone of your stature. The renowned copy ninja, Kakashi Hatake. Kakashi then gave his students a signal, and the trio of genin quickly sprung into action, forming a manji formation around Tazuna, allowing them to guard their client in all directions. However, Zabuza hardly appeared impressed as there was no noticeable shift in his demeanor. In fact, his gaze remained fixed on Kakashi. It was apparent that he only viewed Kakashi as the actual threat. Hard to imagine the likes of you protecting some lowly bridge builder, but now it all makes sense, Zabuza commented. The demon brothers didn't stand a chance against you. Not that they were anything special to begin with. And even harder to imagine a notorious A-ranked shinobi like yourself working as Gado's henchman, Kakashi countered, his hands remaining stuffed in his pockets. It makes me wonder, how much does selling out and sacrificing your pride earn someone these days? Instead of getting angry at the verbal quip, Zabuza merely chuckled. Don't act so high and mighty, Kakashi, he said. I couldn't care less who my client is, so long as I get paid. Sayuri's mind was racing. He was a shinobi hailing from the land of water, which meant that he was likely proficient with water-style ninjutsu. Her eyes then shifted to the lake that ran adjacent to the clearing where they were currently standing. It seemed that he had chosen a battlefield that would give him a decisive advantage. Of course, it went without saying that most of her fire-style ninjutsu would likely prove useless against such an opponent. But, on a positive note, that would mean that Naruto would likely have an edge as well. Her teammate was watching their enemy just as intently as she was, and she could only assume that he, too, was essing the situation. From what she had gathered during their week as teammates, Naruto was very adept at water-style ninjutsu, so at least that was something in their favor. You know, back home, they talk about the Sharingan with almost mythical reverence, Zabuza announced, causing Sayuri to tense as she assumed that he had somehow figured out who she was. It'll be a pleasure to finally see it in action. Kakashi. Sayuri's eyes widened in surprise, and she turned to face her sensei, who remained unfazed. In the interest of saving time, I think I'll humor you, Kakashi casually replied before raising his headband, revealing that his left eye had a vertical scar running down it. But it was when he finally opened the eye that Sayuri froze. There was no mistaking it. Kakashi's left eye was a Sharingan. It was fully evolved too, with 3 tomo, which was more than even she possessed at the moment. Upon seeing the eye, her mind was bombarded by so many thoughts that she couldn't even begin to choose which to address first. In the end, She settled for wondering who the hell her sensei actually was and why he possessed the eye of her clan. There it is. The eye that's allowed you to copy over 1,000 jutsu, Zabuza revealed, much to Team 7's shock, as they were unsure if the statement was merely hyperbole. I wonder if, among all those jutsu, you possess one powerful enough to actually kill me. Kakashi removed his remaining hand from his pocket before using it to mage his neck. The odds aren't in your favor, you know. Zabuza's eyes widened as Kakashi began to rapidly weave through a set of hand signs in the blink of an eye. Finally, he managed to wrench his blade out of the tree and jump out of the way just in time as a MIV fireball came careening toward him. Having narrowly avoided the impact, Zabuza landed on the lake's surface, much to Tazuna's shock. He's standing on water, he muttered in awe as if he hadn't just witnessed someone launch a ball of flames from their mouth. Sayuri, on the other hand, was more focused on her sensei. He possessed her clan's Kekkei Genkei and demonstrated proficiency with one of their signature jutsu. He certainly didn't resemble an Uchiha, though. She would have probably recognized him if he was indeed a member of her clan, or he would have undoubtedly revealed his identity to her by now. Which could only leave one possibility. Is his Sharingan implanted? She pondered as she remembered the scar over his eye. Her curiosity was then replaced with suspicion. Did he steal it? She then noticed Naruto staring intently at Kakashi's back and remembered how he had reacted upon seeing her awakened Sharingan during their spar a week ago. Now certainly wasn't the time for another outburst on his part. Still, either way, she imagined that he was just as confused about the new development as she was. Her moment of rumination was interrupted when she heard Zabuza laugh, no, more like a cackle. Then, she began to notice the air become thick with an almost unnatural mist. Despite most of them being within arm's reach, she began to have trouble seeing her comrades or the client. Even activating her Sharingan didn't help. The mist was saturated with chakra, making it impossible for her to make out any of the signatures surrounding her. Make a single move, and you're dead, Kakashi warned, his tone taking on a more serious edge. Zabuza is a master of the silent killing jutsu. He's trained his entire life to fight under these conditions and can move completely silently through the mist. Team 7 found their eyes widening with shock, and Tazuna was too horrified to even fathom what was happening. Sayuri could feel him trembling behind her back and could smell the alcohol from his bated breath. Naruto was opposite her, so she couldn't quite gauge his reaction. Sakura wasn't faring all that better than Tazuna as Sayuri could hear the kunai rattling in her comrade's hands. Look at all these sacks of flesh, ripe for the picking, Zabuza spoke, though his voice echoed through the mist in a way that made it impossible to pinpoint his location. Now, which of you will I put down first? Sayuri felt her body seize in panic as the sound of Zabuza's voice slithered into her ears. This feeling, the intensity of his malice was making her sick. She felt that if she took a breath or even blinked her eyes, she would be instantly marked for death. So this was what it felt like to be faced with a Jonin who intended to kill. She couldn't stand the feeling. If she had to endure it for much longer, she'd go mad. Her knuckles popped under the strain of how tightly she gripped her kunai, which was now visibly shaking due to the intensity of her grip. She contemplated escaping this hell on her own terms as she looked down at her weapon. Yet, the thought immediately vacated her mind when she heard her sensei speak. Sayuri, Kakashi said, calmly, as if he could read her thoughts. I know it's difficult, but ignore him. I won't let him get close to any of you. Kakashi then formed the ram hand seal and summoned his chakra until it became visible around him. The force of this act was enough to dissipate the mist slightly, at least to the degree where Team 7 could see one another. Now in view of his team, Kakashi looked over his shoulder to face them. When he did, Sayuri immediately felt her fear and anxiety vanish. I won't allow any of my comrades to die, he urged, his eyes crinkling up in a smile. But the fear returned tenfold when she felt a voice directly behind her. Spoken like a man who's failed before. Zabuza was crouched in the middle of the manji formation, having moved so quietly and with such speed that nobody had even seen him until it was nearly too late. Thankfully, Kakashi sprung into action and blitzed the rogue shinobi with a kunai in hand. However, before Zabuza could attempt to cleave Tazuna in two, he found the kunai plunged into his stomach. Naruto grabbed Tazuna and leapt back, creating distance between their client and the ensuing battle. Inwardly admiring her teammates' quick thinking, Sayuri was forced to move in a completely different direction altogether. Once she landed, she observed the wound that Kakashi had managed to inflict on Zabuza and was surprised to see that it was leaking water and not blood. Zabuza then burst into a pool of water, revealing himself to have been a water clone all along. He was clever. Rather than trying to innate Tazuna from the beginning, he was trying to separate them all to make his target as vulnerable as possible. Despite herself, she couldn't help but admire his ruthless calculation. Sensei! Sakura suddenly shouted in warning. Behind you! Kakashi didn't have enough time to react as Zabuza, likely the original, appeared behind him with his cleaver edged back. With a single swing, he managed to cleave Kakashi in two. Sayuri was shocked for an instant before she saw her sensei disperse into water in the same way that Zabuza had earlier. This was the second time today he'd averted death. Meanwhile, Zabuza appeared shocked at seeing his opponent demonstrate such skill in the jutsu of his village. Kakashi then appeared behind him in a manner reminiscent of the tactic that Zabuza had just employed earlier. Yet, Kakashi was apparently more reasonable, merely placing a kunai against his opponent's neck. Give up, he warned, his voice missing any laid-back undertones with which it was usually associated. You're done. Despite his momentary surprise, Zabuza appeared more amused than anything else. You speak with such confidence, Kakashi, Zabuza asked before laughing. Did you actually think you could step into my world and beat me with cheap parlor tricks? Sayuri felt her brow furrow in worry. Despite it seeming as though the battle was all but finished, Zabuza didn't seem concerned at all. It could possibly just be bravado, but her gut was telling her otherwise. Something was definitely wrong, and the battle was far from over. But I must say, you're good. To think that you're so well versed with the water clone jutsu, Zabuza continued. You made quite a racket earlier, so I'd target your clone. Impressive. Just as he finished, Zabuza dissipated into a puddle of water, revealing himself to also be a water clone. The real Zabuza then appeared at Kakashi's back with his blade edged back, ready to cleave him in two. Thankfully, Kakashi crouched down just in the nick of time. Due to the force of his swing, Zabuza's blade was embedded in the ground, and then he let go of the hilt before kicking Kakashi into the river. Zabuza then wrenched his blade out of the ground before vanishing in a burst of speed. Kakashi quickly rose out of the water but appeared incredibly weighed down and sluggish. As he tried to move, he noted that the water felt unnaturally dense and heavy. However, Zabuza appeared behind him on the water's surface before he could react. Copy your way out of this, he taunted while weaving through hand seals. Water style. Water prison jutsu. The water surrounding Kakashi rose out of the lake and encased him in a sphere. Zabuza was holding the sphere of water in place with his right hand while laughing at Kakashi's misfortune. I'll admit, a part of me is disappointed with your performance. But, let's see what your little friends can do, Zabuza mocked before executing a single hand seal. Water clone jutsu. A humanoid shape then rose out of the water before shifting into a perfect clone of Zabuza. Despite being just a clone, Sayuri felt just as uneasy about the sheer power and malice that this clone emanated. With their current strength, they wouldn't even be able to scratch a mere clone of this guy, let alone take on the real deal. This was bad, really bad. Well, what do you say, kids? Zabuza jeered. Your sensei is beaten, and you don't have the strength to take me on. So how about you leave the bridge builder behind, and I'll let you live." When it was clear that Team 7 wouldn't respond, Zabuza vanished in a flash of speed. Naruto didn't even have time to blink before he was targeted, resulting in him being kicked square in the face. The force of the strike was enough to send him skidding across the clearing. The sight caused Sakura to cry out in worry and Sayuri to tense at the possibility of being next. The lingering terror she had been experiencing at the beginning of the battle had subsided slightly, but she was still hardly feeling confident. "Take Mr. Tazuna and run," Kakashi shouted from inside the water prison. "The fight ended the moment I was caught, but as long as he's keeping me trapped in this prison, he can't move. The water clone can't go very far from his real body. So run away, now." The water clone of Zabuza didn't appear all that concerned with what Kakashi was saying. In fact, his attention was still focused solely on Naruto. Having not completely recovered her bearings after the initial attack, Naruto couldn't react to Zabuza stomping down on Naruto's head with a thunderous crack. "I can't just stand here and watch," she thought before charging into action. Sayuri ignored the panicked shouting of both Sakura and Kakashi and threw several shuriken at Zabuza. It proved a relatively easy attack to defend against. Zabuza simply swatted them out of the air with the flat edge of his miv blade. Sayuri then ventured into the air and attempted a downward thrust with a kunai. Zabuza merely reached up as a counter and caught her by the neck. "Another person with the Sharingan, Zabuza remarked. The sheer force of Zabuza's gripe around her throat was astonishingly tight, and Sayuri was confident that she would lose consciousness quickly if she didn't do something. Her eyes then gravitated to the ground, and she saw Naruto, with Zabuza's foot planted onto his back. They made eye contact, and an unspoken plan seemed to exchange between them. Sayuri dropped the kunai she had been holding in her hand, making sure to make it look like she had lost her grip due to the lack of air. Naruto caught the kunai before it could hit the ground and viciously slashed Zabuza's water clone across the tendon. Predictably, water trickled out instead of blood, and Zabuza's clone quickly dispersed into a puddle of water. Even though it had only been a clone, they couldn't help but view it as a victory. Sayuri landed deftly on the ground, and when she took a few breaths and regained her bearings, she saw Naruto standing at her side. He was smirking while also holding out the kunai she had given him during the exchange. "You dropped this," Naruto joked. "And at the perfect time too." Sayuri barely suppressed a smirk of her own and shook her head. "Focus, you moron." It was strange for Sayuri to feel so comfortable fighting at someone's side. Sure, she had worked with Naruto and Sakura during the Bell test, but this was different. Earlier in the battle, she had felt terrified, but now, a distinct feeling of confidence lingered in her chest. Alone, they didn't stand a chance, but together, they might be able to free their sensei and survive. Naruto's eyes then took on an all too familiar devious glint. "Anyway, follow my lead. I'll need a distraction, though." Even though he had just witnessed his clone's destruction, Zabuza appeared more amused than anything else. The little brats had gotten lucky. And yet, for all their efforts, they weren't any closer to coming out on top in this little battle. So, to break their morale, Zabuza formed the hand seal for the water clone jutsu once more, and another copy rose out of the river. Back at the other side of the clearing, Naruto and Sayuri prepared themselves for an attack just in time as Zabuza's new water clone charged toward them. In response, Sayuri weaved through several hand seals before ending with the tiger seal. She then expelled chakra-infused ash from her mouth that blanketed almost the entire area. Zabuza's water clone was caught in the thick of the jutsu and had to cover his face to protect himself from the ash. The jutsu wasn't powerful enough to cause him to dispel, but it burned his skin and prevented him from opening his eyes. The only silver lining was that if he couldn't move through the ash, his opponents wouldn't either. Once the ash began to clear, Zabuza finally opened his eyes and was surprised to see dozens of clones of the blonde kid lunging towards him. When the first clone entered his guard, he quickly dispatched it with his sword. But, to his mild surprise, the clone burst into a cloud of smoke once it was dispelled. Shadow clones, he thought to himself as he effortlessly took down even more of the copies. Impressive at that age. Regardless, even the most powerful jutsu would be ineffective in the hands of a novice. The remaining clones who hadn't already been defeated decided to attack all at once. Each brandishing a kunai, they tried to jump into the air and simultaneously turned Zabuza into a human pincushion. Unfortunately, Zabuza efficiently managed to dispel nearly all the clones with a single swing of his sword. Witnessing the one-sided beatdown, Tazuna could only look on in dismay. "This is it, isn't it?" he mumbled. "We're definitely dying here." Only the original Naruto remained, and as he was skidding back from the impact of Zabuza's attack, he reached into his backpack and pulled out a collapsible Fuma shuriken. He then threw it to Sayuri, who deftly caught it before releasing the weapon. Zabuza couldn't help but scoff at what he perceived as a pitiful display, a shuriken. "That's your plan," he taunted. "A shuriken can't touch me." Unperturbed by his dismissal, Sayuri vanished in a flash of speed before reappearing in the air above. She spun her body to create momentum before hurling the shuriken at the perfect moment. Her Sharingan tracked the weapon's movement, and she watched as it advanced towards Zabuza with impressive speed. Then, to the shock of the man in question, the weapon ped the clone entirely. The real Zabuza merely squinted as he watched the Fuma shuriken approach. It seemed those two brats realized the futility of attacking his clone and decided to aim for his actual body instead. Admittedly, it was an acceptable tactic. Still, the execution could have been better. Did they genuinely expect to finish his off with a mere shuriken? HMPH, nice try, Zabuza remarked before effortlessly catching the shuriken in his left hand. However, his moment of triumph was quickly interrupted as he saw a second, identical shuriken heading his way in the same path as the first. A shuriken hidden in the shadow of the first, Zabuza observed. He recognized this particular jutsu. It was the Shadow Shuriken Jutsu, a technique made famous by Hidden Leaf Shinobi during the previous 3 wars. Meanwhile, Sakura observed the shocking development and couldn't help but be flooded with hope. On the other hand, Naruto and Sayuri were far more composed as they observed their plan in action. The second shuriken was on target, and there was no way that Zabuza would be able to catch it. As he had no other means of avoiding the attack, Zabuza simply jumped over it. Sakura openly gasped at the display, as she had never considered the possibility that their enemy would be able to avoid the attack in such a dexterous manner. All their efforts seemed to be for naught, yet, despite it all, a small smirk spread over Naruto and Sayuri's faces. Suddenly, the shuriken Zabuza had just avoided burst into smoke, revealing it to actually be Naruto using the transformation jutsu. Perhaps even more shockingly, he held a large shuriken that seemed to be made from glowing red chakra. Everyone was shocked by Naruto and Sayuri's clever strategy and the strange weapon Naruto was wielding. At close proximity, Naruto lurched back and threw the chakra shuriken directly at Zabuza's exposed back. At this distance, Zabuza wouldn't be able to dodge, and he wasn't given much time to weigh his options. Ultimately, he did the only thing he could and pulled his hand out of the water prison. Still, the chakra shuriken barely managed to graze him on the cheek, drawing blood. The water prison surrounding Kakashi collapsed back into the water, and Zabuza felt a deep rage building in the pit of his stomach. This little brat managed to draw blood from him just now and concocted a plan that turned the tide of the battle back in his team's favor. On instinct, Zabuza began spinning the Fuma shuriken that he held in his hand and set his aim for Naruto. Currently descending into the river, Naruto could only watch with wide eyes as he realized that he had just become a target. Zabuza pulled back his arm, telegraphing his throw, and Naruto tucked his arms into his body in a preemptive effort to protect his vital spots. "You cheeky bastard!" Zabuza shouted, fully intent on destroying Naruto there and then. Sayuri felt her blood run cold at the possibility that Naruto would be killed. Sure, he was an annoying prick, but she'd be lying if she said that over the past few weeks, she hadn't started getting used to him. Their competitions for who would arrive first, his stupid attempts at getting on her nerves, and their mutual desire to improve and grow stronger were all things she had grown accustomed to. However, before Zabuza could land a fatal blow, Kakashi appeared in a flash and blocked the shuriken with his closed fist. The metal plate on the backhand of his glove allowed him to absorb the attack with minimal damage, but his hand was still rendered bloody. Naruto fell into the water with a splash, but in this case, getting wet was the least of his worries. He was smart enough to realize that had Kakashi not intervened, he would have definitely been killed just then. The very thought caused his stomach to churn. He would have been dead. There would be no coming back from that, and he would have left this world having achieved none of his goals. The very thought was sickening. Soaked, with water dripping down his face, Kakashi raised his head and looked Zabuza in the eye. Upon linking his gaze with the copy ninja, Zabuza couldn't help but flinch at the fierce glare he was receiving. It was exacerbated by Kakashi's Sharingan, which for a single moment, made him look like a man possessed. Even someone like Zabuza couldn't help but be taken aback at the sight. "Kakashi-sensei!" Sakura shouted with glee. Seeing their sensei back in action was enough to fill her, and Tazuna for that matter, with a great deal of hope. This situation was definitely winnable now. "Now, Naruto, what did I tell you about being rude?" Kakashi joked, all the while not shifting his gaze from Zabuza, even for a moment. "I think you've upset our friend here." Despite being a bit disgruntled by the fact that his students hadn't run away as he asked, Kakashi couldn't help but feel proud of their achievement. Naruto knew that defeating Zabuza outright was impossible. He used Sayuri's smokescreen as his opportunity to create shadow clones, which was done to conceal him turning his actual body into a Fuma Shuriken. Sakura looked at her two teammates in awe. Some would call it a fluke, but Naruto and Sayuri's teamwork was flawless. They were on the same page from the beginning, with barely any exchange of words. More impressively, they executed their plan perfectly. Most of the time, they acted like they hated each other, and yet, just now, they had proven themselves to be the perfect team. "I'll admit that you got me, but that was your only shot," Kakashi warned Zabuza ominously as the blood from his hand dripped into the river. "The best move would be to cut your losses and run." The two elite Jonin merely continued staring into each other's eyes, seemingly waiting until someone would blink or, more likely, make the next move. In the end, they both jumped back almost simultaneously to create distance. While midair, Zabuza made a single hand seal. This didn't get past the analytical eye of Kakashi, whose Sharingan seemed to gleam at the sight. Zabuza and Kakashi landed on the water's surface, and the former began weaving even more hand seals. The action was quickly, and perfectly, mimicked by Kakashi, who started making the same seals at an arguably even faster pace. In all, the jutsu took 44 hand seals to complete, and both Kakashi and Zabuza finished simultaneously. "Water style. Water dragon jutsu," they both said. Two dragons made purely from water emerged out of the river, much to the shock and awe of those spectating. The two dragons seemed to grapple before eventually colliding head to head, creating an explosion of water that created waves so large that the river completely overflooded. Naruto was the first to feel the brunt of the impact. Yet, not long after, the water reached even Sayuri, Sakura, and Tazuna, who each braced themselves. Once the water settled slightly, Zabuza and Kakashi were revealed to be interlocked in close-range combat. Kakashi was blocking Zabuza's mid-cleaver with a single kunai. The two pushed against each other's force to see who would budge. Something isn't right, Zabuza thought in alarm. The Sharingan can comprehend and replicate an enemy's jutsu. However, both jutsu occurred simultaneously. Could he? To test his budding theory, Zabuza created distance once more. He then ran to the right, which Kakashi mimicked by mirroring him and running to the left. Zabuza then formed the hand seal for the hidden mist jutsu and was shocked to see Kakashi copy him perfectly once more. Being curious as she was and realizing that Sayuri was likely the person on their team most knowledgeable regarding the Sharingan, Sakura looked to her teammate for an answer. How's he doing that, Sayuri? However, seemingly just as ignorant to whatever was going on as everyone else was, Sayuri failed to come up with an answer. Frankly, she wasn't as knowledgeable about her clan's dojutsu as she would like to be. She knew the basics, but seeing as she had only awakened it recently, it wasn't like she had much experience using it on her own. Nobody was as perplexed as Zabuza. My movements. It's as if he knows what I am going to do next. Kakashi interrupted, finishing Zabuza's thought. Zabuza's eyes widened in shock. What? He thought. Is he reading my mind too? All of Zabuza's attention was then focused on Kakashi's Sharingan. That damned eye. A rage then built up in the pit of his stomach, and he formed yet another hand seal. This time, he'd wipe this smug bastard off of the map. That damned eye. It pisses you off, doesn't it? Kakashi asked while once again mimicking Zabuza's hand seals. Zabuza grunted in frustration. He was getting talked down to like he was some second-rate brat. Don't forget that I had you in the palm of my hand just a minute again, he growled. Weren't so confident then, were you? I'll put you in your place. Both Zabuza and Kakashi said simultaneously, causing Zabuza's eyes to widen even further. Out of sheer frustration and a lack of patience, Zabuza began weaving through another set of hand seals. Anything less than annihilating Kakashi there and now wouldn't serve to repair his wounded ego. I'm not going to kill you, Kakashi, he declared. At least not right away. I'm going to make you watch as I gut those little brats like fish. Then I'll let you die. However, Zabuza was forced to pause midway from completing his jutsu when he noticed a shadow beginning to form behind Kakashi's back. Eventually, it transformed into a perfect copy of Zabuza, performing the exact same hand seals that Kakashi currently was. Me. Zabuza thought before narrowing his eyes. Could this be a genjutsu? Before his theory could be confirmed, Kakashi, who had continued weaving seals during Zabuza's lapse in concentration, finally finished preparing his jutsu. As he did, the tomo in his Sharingan began to spin hypnotically, getting progressively faster and faster. Water style. Giant vortex jutsu, Kakashi announced. Almost immediately, AM of whirling water manifested in front of Kakashi. It quickly increased in volume and power before eventually launching towards Zabuza at blinding speed. The momentum of the jutsu was too high for Zabuza to react in time, and he was overtaken by the crushing force of the vortex. As the jutsu carried him away, Zabuza attempted to swim to gain control. Yet, the current was too powerful, and he ended up being pulled into it. The giant vortex of water also resulted in significant collateral damage to the surrounding area. Trees were swept away, the river flooded again, and the ground was torn up and uprooted. Naruto, in particular, felt the brunt of the jutsu, resulting in him being carried away by the water. Thankfully, he managed to securely grasp a branch that was sturdy enough not to keep him from being pulled away. Sayuri, Sakura, and Tazuna were caught in the aftermath as well. Yet, the water barely reached their knees, and staying in place wasn't that difficult. Eventually, after being carried away for nearly a mile, Zabuza found his back pinned against a tree. He was battered, exhausted, and coughing water. Before he was given even a moment to recover, 4 kunai whistled through the air, embedding themselves in his legs and arms, causing him to grunt in pain. Zabuza then felt a presence nearby and looked to the top of the tree to see Kakashi perched on one of the branches. It seems we've reached the end of your trip, Kakashi observed as the water from his jutsu began to recede back into the river, carrying away branches and bushes and leaving a miv crater in the ground. Was it as good for you as it was for me? How? Zabuza groaned, having now reached a point where he realized victory was no longer possible. Can you see the future? Kakashi grabbed a kunai from his weapon pouch. Yes, he replied. And this is where you die. And then, suddenly, before Kakashi could make a move to take Zabuza's life, 2 Senbon needles flew through the air, piercing directly into Zabuza's neck. The remainder of Team 7, along with Tazuna, could only watch in shock as the body of their enemy seemed to tense before going wholly limp and collapsing face first onto the ground. Kakashi then became alerted to yet another presence, and his head swiveled in the direction the Senbon needles came from. He saw 2 figures standing on a large tree branch, each wearing identical white masks, with thin, curved slits for eyes, red wave designs along the lower portion, and the hidden mist symbol etched on the forehead. Kakashi was immediately able to deduce that they were both Hunter Nin. The one on the right had long black hair, with pinstriped hakama pants that reached his knees. Over this, he wore a green haori with white trimmings, and around his waist, a brown sash that fringed at the end. He also wore light brown platoon sandals with green straps and blue nail polish on his fingernails and toenails. His hair was gathered in a white bun holder, while 2 locks fell loose and framed his face, which was bound at the ends with metal hair cuffs. The other Hunter Nin had shoulder-length white hair and wore a black, sleeveless shirt, light purple-colored pants, and striped leg warmers typical of the Hidden Mist village. His right hand rested casually on the hilt of a katana sheathed on his waist. Based on his relaxed posture, it was clear that he had plenty of experience using it. The long-haired newcomer spoke first, seeming amused at Zabuza's expense, and at last, the great demon of the mist meets his end. Sayuri glared at the 2 new mystery shinobi, as she was unsure if they were friends or foes. The masks almost immediately made them difficult to trust, and today had taught her not to trust any shinobi that weren't affiliated with the Hidden Leaf. Further back at the river, Naruto finally managed to drag himself out of the water. He had witnessed Zabuza's final moments, just like the others, and he couldn't help but feel a bit enraged. This had been their battle. Thanks to his and Sayuri's efforts, Kakashi-sensei could defeat Zabuza alone. Then these 2 bastards swooped in at the last moment and ended things themselves after all the hard work was done for them. Meanwhile, Kakashi jumped from his position in the tree and landed at Zabuza's side. At face value, it looked like he was dead, but it was always safe to be sure. Kakashi placed his fingers against Zabuza's neck and checked for any signs of life. He felt none. No vital signs, he mumbled under his breath before shifting his attention to the 2 Hunter Nin. The long-haired Hunter Nin bowed his head. Thank you. We've been tracking Zabuza for a long time, waiting for an opportune finally take him down. By your mask, I see that you're a Hunter Nin from the village hidden in the mist, Kakashi replied, voicing what he had already figured out earlier. It was clear that the Hunter Nin was impressed by Kakashi's deduction. Our reputation precedes us, even in these lands. He responded. In the shinobi world, Hunter Nin played a very special role. When rogue shinobi broke away from their village, they often carried all kinds of secrets. Hunter Nin were explicitly trained to track down and eliminate such rogue shinobi to ensure that the secrets of their village remained secret. I was tasked with eliminating Zabuza years ago when I was still a boy, the Hunter Nin continued. Meanwhile, his partner remained silent, his hand seemingly prepared to draw his blade at a moment's notice. Thanks to your effort today, I may finally return home. Kakashi's eyes narrowed as he continued to observe the 2 Hunter Nin. Based on their size and body types, they didn't appear to be all that older than Naruto. Yet, they were both already deemed skilled enough to be elite ins. They clearly weren't ordinary kids, but there was something peculiar about them that he couldn't quite put his finger on. Once the pleasantries were out of the way, the white-haired hunter Nin vanished in a burst of speed and appeared crouched at Zabuza's side. He lifted the corpse up and wrapped one of the arms over his shoulder to support the weight, which was impressive considering his size. Your part in this is now over, the other hunter Nin urged from his position on the tree branch. But now, we have to deal with the remains. There are many secrets hidden in this body. They can't be allowed to get into the wrong hands. Then, with a farewell, the two hunter Nin used the body flicker jutsu and disappeared. Once it finally appeared that the fighting was over, Kakashi reached up for his headband and pulled it back over his Sharingan. It wasn't often these days that he was forced to use his Sharingan for such an extended period. Frankly, it was more taxing than he expected. We haven't finished our mission yet, Kakashi spoke up. We still have to get Mr. Tazuna back to his bridge. Tazuna openly laughed, clearly relieved that the crisis had been averted. Sorry I caused you so much trouble, he said. But you can get some rest once we get to my house. Now that was a plan that Kakashi could immediately get behind. He instructed his team that it was time to head out and began walking in the direction of Tazuna's home. However, now that the adrenaline of the battle had subsided, he felt his body completely drained of all energy. Before he could take another step, his body froze and collapsed directly on his face. The last thing Kakashi heard before wholly losing consciousness was Sakura shouting to him in concern, "Kakashi-sensei. Sensei, you're really heavy, ya know." Naruto complained through gritted teeth. Kakashi, whose arm was currently draped over his student's shoulder, had the decency to look embered. Nobody said you had to carry me alone, Naruto. Sakura giggled at the admittedly humorous scene. Kakashi was much larger than Naruto, and it was pretty ridiculous watching him being carried around like a petulant child sprained their ankle. Still, it was rather impressive that Naruto could support the full weight of an adult man all by himself. Even though he was doing an ample amount of complaining, he hadn't lagged behind at all on their journey to Tazuna's home. Be gentle with him, Naruto, Sakura said, her tone decidedly playful as she took the opportunity to tease her sensei. Like you're carrying a teacup, otherwise, you might break him. Kakashi gaped over at Sakura with a look of shock and betrayal. Not you too, Sakura. Sayuri couldn't stop a slight smirk from spreading across her face as she observed Kakashi's predicament, along with Sakura's admittedly funny jab. Seeing her sensei in such a pitiful state was beyond amusing. During their short time together, particularly during the bell test, they'd all been picked on in one way or another by Kakashi. It felt like justice, to be honest, and now that they were safe, letting loose and enjoying the situation was okay. We'll reach my home shortly, Tazuna remarked while looking amused as well. In roughly 2 to 3 minutes, they finally reached the property. Much like all other buildings in the land of waves, Tazuna's house was held over the water by pillars and docks. It was a square, 2-story building with a mill adjacent to the main structure. All in all, it looked rather like what most mainlanders would consider a coastal summer home. A look of pride ped over Tazuna's face as he welcomed his protectors onto his property. Well, here it is, he announced, making a sweeping motion with his hand. I built this place with my own 2 hands. I'm grateful I can call it mine. At this point, a mud hut would do, Naruto remarked before yawning. I'm exhausted. And with that, they were finally given an opportunity for some much-needed rest. Far away, in a clearing deep in the forest, the 2 hunter nin were preparing to destroy Zabuza's corpse. The boy with the long hair was unraveling a kit of medical tools while the boy with the white hair was testing the weight of Zabuza's miv blade in his hand. Despite his size, he was capable of wielding the weapon with ease. What do you think, Haku? He asked. This weapon suits me, does it not? The hunter Nin, apparently named Haku, let out a soft chuckle. Stop playing with that thing, Mangetsu. I need to concentrate. Once all of his equipment was laid out, Haku took a pair of scissors so that he could cut the bandages around Zabuza's face and drain some of the blood. He leaned over the corpse and seemed to ponder where he should cut first before deciding. However, before he could bring the scissors close to Zabuza's face, a hand quickly gripped his wrist. Zabuza's eyes suddenly opened, and he used his remaining hand to pull down his mask, revealing his mouth and sharpened teeth. Enough, he growled. I'll do it. Neither Haku nor Mangetsu appeared surprised that Zabuza was alive. It's so like you to rise from the dead and already be angry, Haku pondered as Zabuza struggled to sit up. With seemingly little concern for his well-being, Zabuza reached up for the Senbon needles embedded in his neck and ripped one out. Damn it, he complained. I'm in no mood for jokes, Haku. Haku shook his head. Who said that I'm joking? He countered in amusement. If you aren't careful while pulling those out, you may actually die. Once the second Senbon was removed, Zabuza visibly relaxed. He then shifted his attention toward Mangetsu, or, more specifically, his sword. Who said that you could wield that, you brat? Zabuza snarled before his eyes darted between Mangetsu and Haku. And how long are you two going to wear those phony masks? Take them off. Haku was the first to do as instructed, removing his mask to reveal an androgynous face that could only be described as beautiful. He had big brown eyes and pale skin, along with a pleasant smile that seemed odd on the face of a trained killer. Mangetsu's appearance, on the other hand, seemed more fitting. He had purple eyes and shark-like teeth, much like Zabuza, which gave him the look of a predator. They both wore hidden mist headbands. If Haku hadn't interfered, you'd be dead, Master Zabuza, Mangetsu argued with a small smile. You should be more grateful. Zabuza scoffed. And what exactly did you do? He asked. Besides playing with something that doesn't belong to you. You always said I would inherit the executioner's blade when you died, Mangetsu explained. And you were technically dead just now. A glare from Zabuza was enough for Mangetsu to relent and stab the blade into the ground and leave it behind so he could relax against a tree. Seeing that his prized possession wasn't being tinkered with any longer was enough to settle Zabuza's nerves. However, it was clear from his posture that he was still agitated and uncomfortable. Apparently, too exhausted to argue further, Zabuza attempted to move but found that his body wasn't quite responding to his commands. There's no point in trying to move now. You'll be out of commission for a week, Haku warned. Although, if you're stubborn as usual, you'll probably recover in half the time. Zabuza gave Haku a sideward glance. You're innocent and clever at the same time, he observed. A rare combination. Speaking of clever, those genin proved more skilled than we could have anticipated, Mangetsu interrupted. Kakashi Hatake is the clear threat, but do you think they'll become a problem as well? Being reminded of his defeat caused Zabuza to scowl. He didn't know what was more humiliating, being outsmarted by a couple of brats or being utterly decimated by Kakashi. It wasn't often he failed as badly as he did today. Not only did he lose the demon brothers and fail to innate the target, but now he would be out of commission for quite a while. That boy, Haku said, clearly referring to Naruto. He uses a strange jutsu, does he not? Mangetsu nodded in agreement. I've never seen anything like it, he admitted. He was able to create a solid weapon using his chakra. Is it possible he could have a Kekkei Genkai like us? Zabuza frowned. And that girl with the black hair had the Sharingan as well. Before today, he wouldn't have been that worried. Yet, after seeing what Kakashi could do, he'd never underestimate the Sharingan again. Even if she wasn't as experienced using it, she could become a threat. I think it would be best if you allow me and Haku to handle those genin, Master Zabuza, Mangetsu proposed. The last thing you need is someone getting in your way again. If only Haku and Mangetsu had been there in the first place, Zabuza thought. He would have had Kakashi finished in that water prison, and that old man would be a corpse in the ground by now. In hindsight, ordering them to not get involved may have been a mistake. However, he couldn't have been able to predict how tricky that situation was going to become. He thought he'd be dealing with some run-of-the-mill Jonin and his trio of brats. Fine. Zabuza relented. Haku smiled before rising to his feet. The mist has cleared, he observed before looking back to Zabuza. Next time, will you be all right? Next time, I'll leave him a bloody pulp on the ground.